Good morning, everyone. Thank you all so much for being here on a beautiful, foggy Bodega Bay morning for our first ever Sea Otter Reintroduction Summit. You know, I am actually sort of a scientist by academic training who currently is a full-time elected official, which really makes me an anomaly. And, you know, too often, scientists don't talk to politicians who often don't recognize the traditional indigenous wisdom held by the tribes who have stewarded this land for tens of thousands of years. And oftentimes also, politicians and government systems don't engage community-based organizations and key stakeholders at the inception of a process. Too often, people kind of come together at the 11th hour when things are already done and you're seeking last-minute endorsements instead of actually having a collaborative, formative process. We are here today to shatter that paradigm. We are here to forge an alliance of tribal, local, state, federal, academic, and community-based partners. But before we begin and before we launch this summit, I want to take one moment just to ground us in place. We are here at the edge of Bodega Bay. Behind me, not all that long ago in the grand scheme of things, thousands of sea otters used to float in rafts. And importantly, we are on the Sonoma coast, which was stewarded for tens of thousands of years by the Coast Miwok and Pomo people. And when you sort of stand here on this space, it's also a space that has very important historic significance to the Federated Indians of Great Rancheria, and the road itself actually that you all drove in on does as well. And so I'm extraordinarily honored to be joined today by Tribal Chairman of the Federated Indians of Great Rancheria, Dr. Gregr Sarris, who will be presenting and providing an introductory welcome. And I just want to acknowledge the tremendous sort of advocate and force of nature that he has been for good in Sonoma County, and not only at the local level, but also at the state and federal level. And as a reminder, this is something that I often say to community members who don't understand why tribes have such influence over certain processes. When we are addressed by a tribal chairman, we are really being addressed by a head of state. And so I am so grateful that you are taking the time out of your day to come and be with us today, and also for your tribe's willingness in general to participate in our local processes and to be a true partner. You have worked alongside many of the folks in this room with regional parks and through joint management agreements and others. So thank you so much, and please join me in a warm welcome for Chairman Sarris.
Thank you so much, Supervisor Hopkins. I've got allergies a little bit, so my voice is scratchy. First of all, thank you all for coming. And again, as you said, it's so important that we work together, especially on anything with restoration or environmental issues here. So often, again, we are consulted after decisions have been made. And again, that's following a long paradigm. You mentioned the road here. It's Smith Brothers. My great-great-great-grandmother was Supu. She was born in Petaluma and escaped the Mexicans there, escaped Vallejo, walked 50 miles barefoot up the coast to Matini, the village at Fort Ross. And there she had 3 children by what they used to call a Creole, a guy that was Aleut, a Russian, and Kashaya Pomo. It was very interesting because the Russians, as you know, brought the Aleuts here to help them hunt the sea otters. But anyway, when the Russians abandoned the fort in 1842, she took her 3 children and came down to Bodega Bay and became the maid/mistress of Captain Stephen Smith. She named her first 3 children Smith to protect them from slavery, from marauders. And so we're all Smiths. It's just, and it's biblical. It's just which do we come from, Comchatal or Smith? The Smith brothers here are the descendants of Stephen Smith. All right, a little bit about who we were. Obviously, as has been mentioned, you're on Coast Miwok territory here. At the time of contact, there were about 20,000 people who were classified as Coast Miwok or Southern Pomo. Southern Pomo being southern Sonoma County, and Coast Miwok, all of Marin County. There was never no tribe called Coast Miwok or Pomo. Those are ethnographers' names. They classified us by language families. Coast Miwok is a Penutian language, and Pomo is a Hokan language. Pomo, for instance, the language family goes into Oaxaca, Mexico. The Penutian language family goes up into Alaska and Canada. We lived in small nations, 1,000 to 2,000 people in a nation, very small nations. There were more people in this area and generally in Central California than there was anywhere else in the entire New World except for the present site of Mexico City, which was the Aztec capital. People say, how did so many people live together for so long with virtually no physical warfare? Well, of course, the missionaries and others thought we were stupid. And of course, the Europeans thought we were the stupidest of the Indians because, as with most of us, we see through things, other cultures, other people through our own lens. And what did the Europeans value? The Europeans valued organized warfare, and the Plains Indians had organized warfare. Of course, never want to stop and think about how many people could live together so closely. Simply put, we were societies constructed of small secret societies where we believed you had special spirits and you were brought in as usually when you were young, 13 or 14, and inducted into these secret societies. We believed that everything on earth was sacred. A rock, a piece, anything was sacred, and if you violated it, it would come back. So each person also had songs and was considered sacred. I have songs and things that would protect me, but if you stole something from me or hurt me or did something like that, the next day your mother or somebody would drop dead. We poisoned you. So the early ethnographers classified our cultures as cultures predicated on fear and black magic, when in fact they were predicated on profound respect. If I had to go and hit Supervisor Hopkins, you would see that I had no spiritual power. Physical warfare was considered the lowest form of warfare. So, and again, it worked. The societies were structured with nature in a sustainable way. To be members of these secret societies, when you were training, you had to abstain from meat and sex for 7 years. So again, we kept the populations down considerably. The missions came 1776, San Rafael 1812, Mission Solano, the last mission in the chain, 1823. Then the Mexican period came, and the Mexicans used exactly what the Spanish and Portuguese used to colonize the New World. They were Catholic, they were against slavery, but they got around it. Indentured servitude, vagrancy laws, and convict leasing. That's essentially how they justified enslaving the entire New World. The first piece of legislation that was enacted in the state of California in 1850 was the Act for the Government and Protection of Indians, which legalized Indian slavery. Indians became the rightful property of whosever land they were on, and they had the right to sell them or use them or do whatever. That was not repealed until 1868, 3 years after the end of the Civil War. Ironically, General Vallejo, who was defeated by the first governor of this state, was the one who told the governor how to handle the Indian situation. So he gave him the blueprint for our continued enslavement. We then, after 1868, here became indentured servants of whosever land we were on. In my case, it was because of Supu and others who were able to be mistresses to the early Americans that we were here. Today, there are 1,500 enrolled members of the Federated Indians of Great Rancheria who are descendants of Coast Miwok and Southern Pomo. All of us trace our ancestry back to one of 14 survivors, all of whom were women, all of whom were concubines of early Americans or the Mexicans. So went the Indians, the natives, the indigenous people, so went the otters, so went the trees, everything else. The first historical record that we know of the sea otter hunting from Americans was about 1806, and then of course the Russians came and were right around in this bay where there were so many otters. And eventually in 1812 they established, as I alluded to earlier, they established a colony up at Fort Ross. They left, they abandoned the fort in 1842 because they had killed all the otters from Monterey all the way past Point Arena and Eureka. They were trading the pelts with the Chinese. They came down here specifically to hunt the pelts. That's why they came. And so when we think today about what we're going to do and how we're going to work together, I want you to imagine what it was like for indigenous people who believed everything was sacred and everything was interconnected and anything you did to anything would have consequences, to a people who came and were chopping down the trees, killing the animals, and doing all of the kinds of things that were so antithetical to the way we thought. And, the Kashayapomo people up north call the Europeans or white people Palachai, and that translates to miracles. And I used to ask the old people why they called white people miracles. And they said because when they were coming and killing everything, cutting down trees, damming up the water, instead of getting punished, more of them kept coming. We thought they were miraculous. Well, again, as we sit here today and think about the otters and what we're going to do, we have to think, again, out of that European system. The Europeans believed in that great chain of being, God on top, man, of course, woman below man, all the way down. And they had the right to do anything, and only God up above, who doesn't live somewhere up there, is sacred. Your home isn't here, it's up there. So how do we shift a mindset? How do we think about reintroducing the otters? We can't think about a keystone species without thinking about the entire ecosystems and ourselves in it. That's the holistic indigenous way of thinking. And, so often people want to introduce or protect a keystone species, but they forget the modern world in which we're in and all of the things we have to negotiate as we do this. So, can we consider the urchins, the abalone, the kelp, all the things that the sea otters need to survive? How are we going to take care of that as we're sitting here today thinking we want to take care of the otters? We have to think holistically. We have to work together. We have to forfeit that mindset of single purpose to whole purpose. And I hope that that's exactly what we'll be doing today. So thank you very much, and thank you for having me.
Thank you so much, Chairman Sarris. That was a really wonderful note to begin on. And I am actually going to be introducing Tracy Lyons, who will be sort of facilitating everything. And I'm guessing that every single person in this room heard from Tracy. She has been the magic behind the creation and the bringing together of this summit. And I also wanted to take a moment and ask any other tribal representatives who are present to stand, because there is actually a wonderful network of tribes coming together to really kind of advance this cause. And I know this is a sort of top priority. So I would like to sort of stand and acknowledge your participation, if you would. Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you. And I unfortunately received word that Chairman Franklin was unable to join us, and Nina Hapner, who I believe is also part of the Marine Tribal Network, was unable to attend as well. But the good news is we have a very packed agenda, and so this will actually give us a little bit of leeway. And I do want to mention, before we transition to our first panel, that we will have an opportunity during lunch to do a brief round of introductions, because I'm guessing that there are a lot of folks who would like to know who the other folks are in the audience, and everyone who is here for a reason and has a role to play. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and hand it over to Tracy to introduce our next moderator.
Good morning. It's so wonderful to see everyone in person. And today I have the honor of introducing Dr. Brent Hughes, Assistant Professor at Sonoma State University. Dr. Hughes specializes in ecology and conservation of marine ecosystems. He is broadly interested in determining the processes that affect the stability of coastal ecosystems. His research centers around coastal habitats, seagrass, salt marsh, and kelp, which provide valuable ecosystem services, yet are threatened by human activity and increasing ecological crises. Please join me in giving a warm welcome to Dr. Brent Hughes, moderator of our first panel, Sea Otter History and Status on the Northern Coast and Potential Reintroduction Options. And as Dr. Hughes makes his way to the stage, please note that underneath your table number, there is a stack of papers that you can record questions on for our panel moderators, and we'll have a Q&A session toward the end of our day together.
Thanks, Tracy. So today we're going to have several panels kind of discussing what we know about sea otters and their role in marine ecosystems, especially here in Northern California. The first panel that's going to come up is going to talk about the history of sea otters. And we're primarily going to focus on the history of sea otters here in Northern California. But I need to at least spend a little bit of time just kind of informing folks, why are we here talking about one single animal? And as Chairman Sarris mentioned, the sea otter has this term that's associated with it called a keystone species. And what does that mean? Well, it means that they have this disproportionate effect on ecosystems. And because of it, they play this keystone role. They have this role in ecosystems primarily because they eat a lot. Compared to any other marine predator that we know of, the sea otter proportionally, based on their diet and their weight, eat about a quarter of their biomass every single day to survive. And because of it, they have these huge effects on marine ecosystems. And because of that, there's also this conflict that occurs because they like to eat the same things we humans like to eat, such as abalone and urchins and crab. And so there's where, the dilemma is. The sea otter, currently, we don't see them out here. They were once here, as you can see from these posters that have been put up. They were once here. In fact, their range extended from basically all the way around the North Pacific Rim, from Japan to Russia to North America, all the way down our continent, all the way to Baja, Mexico. So they had this really broad distribution. Then, as Chairman Sarris mentioned, they were hunted for their pelts. They have some of the softest pelts. Has anybody touched a sea otter pelt in this audience here? It's probably the softest thing you'll ever touch. And so you can understand why maybe their pelts were really sought after and prized. But that led to their near extinction. And here in California, we thought they were actually extinct in the early 1900s. And there was this colony that was found off the coast of Big Sur. There's about 50 animals. And from that, the sea otter population here has expanded to about 3,000. And it's still kind of at this level where there's concern about the population. So today's panel, we're going to discuss the history of the sea otter here in Northern California. And we're going to hear from 4 distinguished panelists. First, Chairman Sarris from the Federated Indians of Great Rancheria, Lilian Carswell, who is the director of the Sea Otter Recovery Program for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, Gena Bentall, who is the director for Sea Otter Savvy, and joining us online, I believe, is Dr. Tim Tinker, who's with Inhydra Consulting and adjunct professor at UC Santa Cruz. You're gonna hear about different periods of time. And so there's really 4 main periods of time that we're gonna be discussing. There's gonna be pre-human history, or what we call deep history. And this is the evolutionary history of the sea otter that dates back millions of years. Then we're going to hear about first settlers' history. And that's, basically the last few thousands to 10,000 years. Then we're going to hear about European hunter-settler period, which was about 200 years ago. And then we're going to hear about this most recent period as well, the last 100 years that has been kind of devoid of sea otters. And we've had because of this historical accident, we've had a lot of the changes that have occurred on our coast, be it with industry and how we humans are interacting here with the ocean. So with that said, I think it's time to bring up our panelists, and we will be discussing the history of sea otters. Okay, panelists, you ready? Okay, great. We're going to first start out with Chairman Sarris. And Chairman Sarris, what do we know about the connection, the historical connection between sea otters and Native American communities, or more specifically, the connection between sea otters and the Federated Indians of Great Rancheria? This is a two-part question. Secondly, we'd like to know, how are sea otters being integrated into the mission of the Federated Indians of Great Rancheria, and also your environmental management plans?
Okay, thank you so much for asking. Well, the historical connection. I love scientists. They do these, millenniums and all of this sort of stuff. When people always say to us, "Oh, you came down the Bering Straits," and I say, "No, but I have my bearings straight." When you're talking 10,000, 12,000, 14,000 years, really, who's counting? We evolved with a changing landscape. The landscape is always changing. Consequently, or subsequently, the culture is always emerging. What we know about pre-contact relationships with the sea otter is that, like the Russians, like the early Americans, we liked feeling those pelts too. And we often used them and hunted them for cloaks and blankets. So especially the coastal people, where the more inland people used rabbits, the coastal people would use the otter pelts. And again, the landscape was so rich and plentiful, they were quite easy to get. We forget that they went up the waterways. So they went up the Russian River, they went up the creeks, and there was one time of year principally when we would hunt them, and that's when we were both the otters and people doing the same thing, and that was getting the salmon coming up the rivers and creeks. So again, that was easy because the salmon were coming so thick, and the otters would be right there, and it was easy to get them. But again, one of the most important things is that we, understood. We just took obviously what we needed. They always used to say the Bodega people here had more pelts and so forth, because the saying goes, it was cold and windy here, and we were weak, so we needed to be warm. But in any event, it was part of a larger system where we worked together. When the salmon were running, for instance, there was the sea otter, but there was also grizzly bears that were there doing the same thing. So we were all working it out together. In fact, as I mentioned, there were so many people here, but there were more grizzly bears here than there were people. So we had relationships and so forth. The redwoods were so big and dark that so many of the animals, the plains animals, the pronghorn and the elk that were on the plains wouldn't go into the redwoods. That made it so easy for the first Europeans to hunt them. They actually just chased them to the edge of the redwoods and kill them. like running buffaloes over a cliff. But anyway, we had this kind of relationship. I don't know anything about eating them, but I used to hear the old people talk so often about the pelts, that they were the softest pelts, and people would love them. In fact, you'd give gifts of sea otter pelts when you were courting somebody. You'd give it to their parents. It's really interesting. You didn't give much to the person you were courting. You had to give it to their parents. But anyway, let me move to the second question about how does it fit in with our broader mission and environmental stewardship of restoration. Jumping back, one of the things that we did, we were illegally terminated by the federal government in 1966. And as you know, I wrote a bill and we got our rights restored in 2000, December 27th, 2 weeks before Clinton went out of office. And we weren't going to do gaming. That was true. We were going to try to do other things and organic things. So, you know, cheese factories all came and they wanted to be on our land because they wouldn't have to pay taxes, right? But nobody wanted to have the money to give us land, money for land here. So people began to discuss the C word. And I said early on to the council, I said, I'll stay with us. I told all my dad's family, I'll stay with you, but we have to make sure that whatever we do with whatever opportunity we have, it must be predicated on the ethics of the old people, of the ancestors. That means it must benefit Indian and non-Indian alike. It must be a mission of social justice and environmental stewardship. And I know at the time that sounded very antithetical, but I'm happy to say 9.5 years in, we have donated $87 million to those causes. We then also did the precedent-setting agreement with the county, with Tole Park, and now with 27,000 acres of Point Reyes National Seashore, the first in the country, where we're co-managing 50-50. Nobody makes a decision without the other. And so again, it's a great opportunity to use traditional ecological knowledge as we think about these things. And one of the things that I think about, you know, when we consider what to do with our resources and so forth, is how are these things connected to other things? How are they connected to other environmental programs? How can this be sustained? And the problems are immense. People want to go back to the world where there was otters and everywhere like that. That world is gone. The landscape used to be our Bible. Stories were associated with features of the landscape. They became mnemonic pegs on which we hung our culture. And those markers are gone. Much of the text is gone. But we do have, all of us here, still have shards of that text to read. And so when we look at, for instance, restoring the elk population at Point Reyes, when we look at restoring the sea otters, we think, how do we do this cognizant of the world that we live in today? Because it isn't the way it was. People want to do controlled burning the way we used to do it. Well, you didn't have all the undergrowth that you have now. The world was completely different then because we were managing it. And so what we look at is projects and ways, and we consider how much work it's going to have to be to do these things. What other things are affected? How best can we use our resources to, again, step by step, create a sustainable future for ourselves and our kids? And so those are the kinds of things we look at. And as we would consider the sea otter or here, it would be the same kind of thing. It would be what are we doing here? What's the vision? What are the obstacles? As you mentioned, people can't even get abalone anymore. I'm so old, when I was a kid, they were like this. You know, they're gone. And even this kelp, I mean, certain groups of people now we used to pick the sea kelp. Certain groups of people now are just chopping it right off the rocks and it's not growing back. And so what do we do to protect the landscape, the environment, so that there can be otters in it?
Wow, thank you so much for that, Chairman Sarris. We are now going to move over to Lilian Carswell. And if you don't know Lilian, she's kind of a history buff with sea otters, with regards to sea otters. She knows a lot. So I'm going to start out with a fun question. And Lilian, I would like to pretend that we have a time machine right now. All of us jumped into a time machine, and we are transported back to the year 1700. What would it look like out here in Bodega Bay and on the outer coast?
Well, I'll take a guess at that. So we know that there were thousands and thousands of sea otters in California. Perhaps 20,000, perhaps 30,000, we don't know exactly. The reason we know this is because the fur traders kept records of how many pelts they took. So we have some idea of how many sea otters were there. In Bodega Bay, specifically, in 1809, Ivan Kuskov came here, and he left with 2,000 pelts. They may not have all come directly from Bodega Bay, but they came from the surrounding areas. It's records like that that show us that it was a really different world. But part of that world was also the invertebrates. There were abalone, there were sea urchins, there were crabs, there were marine worms. Sea otters did not drive them extinct. That's why we have them today. Sea otters were part of this web with all of those other organisms. And in fact, they had surprising indirect benefits. So Brent has already told you about some of the effects of a keystone species. Sea otters reduced the densities of these marine invertebrates, so there were fewer of them around, and most of them were tucked in deep crevices, or the clams were under the sand. But the urchins and the abalone were tucked in these deep crevices where sea otters couldn't reach them. And instead of attacking the kelp holdfasts directly, they waited for the drift kelp to fall down into the crevices. And in fact, it's believed that sea otters are responsible for the evolution of large body size in abalone in the North Pacific, precisely because of this effect they have on the marine invertebrates. By protecting the kelp from herbivores that would attack it directly, pushing them into the crevices where they waited for the things that fell down, they allowed the kelp to reduce its chemical defenses. And when you reduce all those phytochemicals in the kelp, it's more nutritious and healthful for every single organism that depends on it.
Great, thanks. So jumping to more recent history in the Marine Mammal Protection Act of 1972, that law prohibits the take of animals listed under the Protection Act. How can sea otter reintroduction be authorized if take isn't allowed?
So great question. So the Marine Mammal Protection Act recognized the ecological role of marine mammals. And it was really a visionary law in that respect. And it mandated the managing agencies, so that would be U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and National Marine Fisheries Service, and together we have jurisdiction over the marine mammals. It mandated us to restore those populations to levels at which they would once again be significant functioning elements of the ecosystems of which they're a part. It wanted us, this law directs us to restore the ecological relevance of sea otters. And so it's true that the Marine Mammal Protection Act prohibits take of marine mammals, but it has certain exceptions. And to use those exceptions, you obtain a permit. So if reintroduction would be covered under one of those exceptions, but Fish and Wildlife Service would have to obtain a permit before any reintroduction could proceed.
Great. Tracy, can I get a time check? Are we good on time?
You're doing well at 9:40.
Okay, great. One more question, Lilian. How does in piggybacking a little bit off Chairman Sarris, how does the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service incorporate traditional ecological knowledge into their management decisions?
So we want to make decisions based on the best available information. And one of the most important things we want to do is avoid the problem of shifting baselines. So the problem of shifting baselines arises when we have environmental degradation happening over time, but we have people being born into that situation. So they look around, they grow up with it, they're like, this is totally normal. But they don't know what happened before them. And at a certain point, especially if they're colonizers and they're moving around, they have no historical memory, they have no oral memory. We want to avoid that problem. And so how do we make decisions based on that? We're not trying to go back to the past, but we need to understand the past conditions. We also can't be constrained to the present. So we use written records like the fur trader records. We use archaeological evidence like looking at middens. We use scientific studies that take sediment cores and look at isotopes, which can tell us what's happening. And we rely on traditional ecological knowledge, the stories that have been passed down orally by people who have been here and who have had a continuous presence and passed down that knowledge. That's not to say that we don't care about the present. We absolutely want to understand current impacts as well. And so any process that we would initiate would involve multiple opportunities for feedback from people, comments, concerns, questions, information. We want to understand both the historical situation and any current impacts that any action we would propose to take. And so part of the reason for this panel, this is sort of like our first toe in the water to even just talk about reintroduction. We want to hear from people what the past was, what the present is, what potential impacts could be. We just want to open a conversation. There's no decision, there's no formal proposal on the table. This is the beginning of a long conversation.
Okay, thank you. And so what I'm hearing, I think that is kind of coming out from this is that perhaps going back to the past, exactly how it was, in 1700, is probably not a possibility. And so, thank you for that. That wasn't supposed to be funny. So anyways, so we're going to shift to Gena Bentall, the director of Sea Otter Savvy, who, if you're not aware of, these are the posters that you're seeing around, and these awesome water bottles that have been passed around come from Sea Otter Savvy. And Sea Otter Savvy has developed an education program based on that slogan, "We Were Here." So Gena, can you tell us a little bit about how the history of sea otters here in Northern California has informed this "We Were Here" slogan?
Yeah, just to give a little information background to the We Were Here Sea Otter program. First, Sea Otter Savvy is a nonprofit organization that's focused on research and outreach to both better understand human impacts to sea otters and foster community engagement in their stewardship. And We Were Here was created as an educational component of Sea Otter Savvy to address a perceived gap in awareness that was becoming more noticeable to us in our engagement with the public. And that was, in general, a lack of understanding that sea otters once lived on the Northern California coast, or that they were even missing from the Northern California coast. So kind of two opposed different misconceptions and misunderstanding about their ecological impacts, their history, all these kinds of things. And so we really developed We Were Here as a way of addressing and providing information to the public about science-based as well as history and the most current information about recovery efforts, and also, most importantly, going back to our community engagement component of Sea Otter Savvy, we wanted to provide a platform for those that wanted to participate. So there's a survey public survey on the We Were Here page. If you scan the QR code on our posters, that'll take you right to that page and that survey. And anyone can take it and you can voice your opinion, and many of you have already participated. Thank you so much. And those results from that survey go directly to the people that are involved in the reintroduction process. So that's really, really how the foundation of how we got started with that.
Great. So I'm going to follow up with a question. Why is awareness and engagement with local and broader communities so important in tying together what has happened in the past with regards to sea otters and what might happen in the future?
Yeah, so I give a lot of talks about coexistence between humans and sea otters. We work mainly on the Central Coast with recreationists, so it's about, we're trying to resolve conflicts over space specifically, but we're always talking about coexistence. And I really almost always open every talk I give with 3 important takeaway points from the history of sea otters. And the first you're gonna hear a lot about, you already have heard a lot about, and that's that there's this tremendous impact, near devastation to this species caused by human actions, without which we would not be sitting in this room today having this discussion. So we're having this because of human actions. The second component that I always like to remind people, you're gonna hear a lot about science, sea otter ecology, keystone species today, and the fragmentation of sea otter populations by hunting is really the reason why we're able to test questions related to ecology and the reason why we have a lot of knowledge about sea otter impacts on ecosystems. And so it's kind of a backwards way of thinking about that horrible catastrophic event to sea otters because that created this fragmentation, the ability to compare populations with and without sea otters. That's why we have the knowledge we have. So I just like to kind of found that found our understanding of science in that context. And then finally, it's really important to remember, and this seems kind of obvious, Lilian's kind of alluded to it, and Chairman Sarris as well, is that sea otters are returning to a coastline that is fundamentally different from the one that they were removed from 200, 100 years ago in terms of human industry, urbanization, development, all of the things. So think about the California coast specifically and all the development that has occurred since 1700 when we can't unfortunately go back in time. And this has created sort of a situation where as they're recovering into places where humans are already established in all of those things, their industry, their living, their recreation. And as we have been working in Sea Otter Savvy, we've sort of been having to try to play catch up in the recent history in terms of already established activities that are having to adapt to sea otters moving in. And so one of the reasons we really feel like it's important to move ahead of that game into Northern California is to kind of get communities already engaged and already working and thinking about what it would be like if sea otters return here, whether it's by natural range expansion or by reintroduction or however that happens, so that we can have communities that are welcoming them back and are already ready for what their world would look like with sea otters here.
Great. Thank you so much, Gena. And I think, San Francisco Bay is probably one of those shorelines that we can think of that has changed dramatically, but we know historically was the home to probably thousands of sea otters in that one bay alone. And what would it look like today? It's hard to say. Okay, so our next panelist, I think we're gonna get him on. He lives in Canada. He lives in Nova Scotia, very far away from us. But this is Dr. Tim Tinker, and he is one of the authorities on sea otters, probably in the entire world. And we often lean to Tim. We, as the scientific community, lean towards Tim to help us with statistics and modeling and these kind of high-level kind of activities. So based on that, Tim, you are using sophisticated models to predict the future. in regards to sea otter recovery and recolonization. How much does history play into these models and inform these models that are making these really important predictions?
Yeah, thanks, Brent. I might have a little bit of echo here, hopefully not too much. So I'm going to answer that by saying mostly they are not informing, but a little bit they are informing models. And I've never thought of my models as being sophisticated, so thank you for that. So we've heard a little bit about history and the historical context already from the other panelists. We know, for instance, in deep history, we don't know exactly how many sea otters were present at any one time, whether we're talking 100,000 years ago or 2 million years ago. We know sea otters were there from the fossil records. And we also know, as I believe Lilian referred to, that they were sufficiently abundant that they had very strong impacts on the rest of the coastal ecosystem all the way around the North Pacific. We know this from the evolution of abalone, of kelps, of macroalgae, even stellar sea cows. We know that sea otters influenced the evolution of the entire ecosystems around that. And so they had to be sufficiently abundant to be having those magnitude of effects. But since we don't know those numbers, there's not really much point in trying to insert those any sort of wild guess estimates into a model. More in terms of more recent historical, the last 10,000 years, which we've heard quite a bit about, some really insightful thoughts about that from Chairman Sarris. We do know sea otters were there from traditional oral histories and knowledge of the indigenous people that lived here, as Chairman Sarris has informed us, and also from tribes up and down the Pacific coast in North America. We know that humans and sea otters coexisted, and that there were cultural mechanisms or traditions and ways that humans and sea otters were able to coexist over that entire length of time. For more than 10,000 years, humans and sea otters were able to coexist. We don't know exactly how many there were, but again, we know that there is sufficient abundance that they appear in midden records up and down the coast throughout that entire period. So we do know that they were pretty abundant, that they were geographically widespread. And I think the most important thing we know is we have learned, as Chairman Sarris indicated, humans and otters had figured out how to coexist. And that's really important because that's what we're talking about today. Can humans and sea otters coexist again? We believe they can because they did for an awful long time. And then finally, the last little sort of blip in history, the last 200 years since the fur trade, that period of time does inform the models that I work on with many other people a little bit. We know the history of recolonization of sea otters, both via reintroductions from management in British Columbia and Southeast Alaska and other places, and by their natural recolonization in many places. We have a fair amount of information, data from those sort of natural experiments, as Gena just alluded to. And we're using as much of that information as we can to help inform our models how sea otters have recolonized, the rate at which they do that, the types of densities that they achieve in different types of habitats, and even more recently, how they interact with people in these different ecosystems and different contexts. So yes, that most recent history is the one that is most data rich, and that is where we are trying to use those information to inform our models. But we recognize that that's a very recent history. So we recognize the information that we're using is not complete yet. We're still learning how sea otters and people and ecosystems will coexist. So we don't know exactly what the right numbers are yet, but we're learning as we go along.
Okay, Tim, thank you. One other question, and you might have already answered some of this, but do you think sea otter recovery efforts will lead to historical levels of sea otters in California? And if so, how long might it take?
So that is something we do know something about. Again, as mentioned, because we have the example of the last 100 years of recovery here in California, but also similar sorts of histories of sea otter recovery and recolonization up and down the Pacific coast of North America, and even throughout the Aleutian Islands, and even in the other side of the Pacific. So that tells us something about how sea otters the populations grow and spread spatially. And one of the most important things we've learned from that period of time is that they don't spread very fast. They obviously, when we reintroduce them to a new place, that sort of gives a little bit of a jump in the process. But because their natural history is highly localized, they tend to, individual animals, particularly adults, don't move very far up and down the coast. They're different from other marine mammals in that sense. So they think local and they live local. That means that the rate at which their population naturally spreads up a long linear coastline like California or Oregon or really a lot of the coast of North America is remarkably slow. It's taken them almost 100 years to just spread from Big Sur up into just north of Santa Cruz. It's a distance that you can hop in your car and drive that in a couple of hours. It's taken them about a century to grow that far. And our models are, when we plug in information on what we know about their birth and death rate and their individual movements rate, this actually makes sense. So we can use our models to project forward. How long will it take them to get, say, up to Bodega Bay or Fort Bragg or Eureka, based on that current natural rate of recolonization and range spread? And the answer is a long, long time. I just ran the model actually this morning, just to have a little bit of information, but really we're looking at, based on the current rate of range spread that we've observed over the last century, probably another 200 years before they achieve historical abundance throughout all of California. And that may sound remarkable, but that's actually fairly optimistic based on the rate at which they've been spreading. So reintroduction might speed that up somewhat, but it's not going to speed it up as much as maybe a lot of people think. Even if there were 20 to 50 animals released, say, in Fort Bragg, it would still be another 30 to 40 years before they spread down the coast to Bodega Bay, and maybe 50 years before they spread up to the Mendocino area, up to Eureka. So it's the perception that if we put a few in Northern California, they're suddenly going to spread all over California, also is not consistent with what we know about sea otter biology.
Great, Dr. Tinker. Thank you so much for videoing in from your place in Nova Scotia. It's always great to see you and be enlightened by your answers. But I think the key thing that Tim, and I'll just reiterate it, is that if sea otters move up here, it's going to take a really, really long time for them to grow to these levels where they were historically. And so this is a long process we're talking about, and not just something that happens all of a sudden and overnight. You have thousands of sea otters up and down the northern California coast. So that wraps up the first panel for today. I want to thank all of our panelists for your great answers and enlightening knowledge about sea otters and the system up here. So if we could, everybody give them a round of applause.
Thank you to our moderator and our wonderful panelists. And now I'd like to take this opportunity to welcome the moderator of our next panel, Exploring Potential Impacts on Marine and Kelp Ecosystems, Heather Barrett, Science Communications Director and Research Scientist at Sea Otter Savvy. Heather's interest in sea otter conservation and ecology developed through her undergraduate degree at UC Santa Cruz and her internship at the Monterey Bay Aquarium. She also completed graduate research at Moss Landing Marine Laboratory. And as Science Communications Director for Sea Otter Savvy, Heather refines science communication strategies, oversees creation of promotional science-related materials, leads science-related media relations, and develops special projects for outreach that support Sea Otter Savvy's mission. As research scientist, Heather continues her research interests in human disturbance to sea otters and mitigating human-sea otter conflicts. Please join me in welcoming Heather. And Heather, feel free to take a seat.
Yeah, I'll stand up here and then I might sit down. Hi, everyone, and thank you so much, Tracy, and thank you, Representative Hopkins, for initiating this summit. As Chairperson Sarris mentioned, it is so important to have these open discussions and to be inclusive and really have that whole view. So I'm so excited to be here, and I'm honored to have been asked to moderate this panel, which is exploring potential impacts on marine and kelp ecosystems. The goal of this panel is to give everyone a little bit of a foundation about marine ecosystems here in California, as well as to highlight the potential impacts and influences a potential sea otter reintroduction could have on these ecosystems, and touch on questions that we've actually received through our We Were Here Sea Otter survey, as well as through different community and stakeholder representatives. So I'm actually going to keep this one pretty short because we have a lot of questions to get through. But I am joined by Dr. Joshua Smith with the Monterey Bay Aquarium, Richard Ogg, a longtime fisherman here in Bodega Bay, Dr. Brent Hughes, who you just met, with Sonoma State University, and Dr. Tim Tinker with Anhydra Ecological Research. So I'm going to ask them to come join me now so we can get started with the long list of questions to get through.
You should have this one.
I will sit down. Well, thank you all for being here. And we are going to do it a little bit differently. We're going to kind of jump through each of the panelists for a few different series of questions. But I'm going to start off with you, Richard. It's so good to see you, and it was so good to chat with you earlier. You have had an extensive career in fisheries, and I really wanted to touch on something that we talked about was what being a fisherman meant to you. And can you briefly touch on some of the changes that you've witnessed recently in the coastal habitat locally and if there's been any associated impacts to your business that you've seen?
Impacts to what now?
Impacts to your business and some of the changes that you've seen.
Okay, well, in terms of a fisherman in general, it's I have to say it's an incredible industry to be in, and the freedom and the love of the ocean has really been something that has been with me forever. I've lived in Sonoma County for 62 years, and I've been on the water over 50. And in that time, it's given me the opportunity to kind of realize how important it is for us as a commercial industry to be able to provide a resource to the public, that is, belongs to you. And we are we're really, overall, we are the conservationists that people don't maybe understand a lot about our perspective, and that, if we don't conserve and take care of the ocean, we don't have a way to make a living. So it's real important that we do the right thing and protect the waters and provide that resource to you. The changes that I have seen over the years have been significant in some respects, and then in others not as great. We've had temperature changes, water changes, species shift that has impacted our ability to access, a resource under many, many conditions. And so we've done our best to be able to, adapt to these situations. But in general, it's becoming more and more difficult based, on what our opportunities are in terms of regulation and environmental changes. So I don't know if that answered all the questions or not.
Well, that was excellent.
Yeah.
And I also wanted to ask you, is there
Is there a question from you or from the fishing community that you feel needs to be addressed in summits like this? Is there something that overarching that you feel needs
Regarding this particular situation?
Yeah, about
Okay.
potential reintroduction.
I think, in general, and this is primarily my perspective, philosophically, I'm very much a nature-oriented individual, and my feelings are that nature has its way, and we need to be very cognizant of that, and not, man has a tendency to interfere with many situations, and it's very important to look at this holistically and understand that things will adapt and change in their own methods, and for us to impose our perspectives and our concepts on these changes that we feel are important, from my heart, it doesn't feel right. So it's important that I express that, in that I question whether this is a decision that we should be making, or if it's something that nature should make. And I think that's real important to keep in perspective. And I also have to say that we have to be very cognizant of unintended consequences. 30 years ago, we didn't think about microplastics. We didn't think about, things that can impact the environment in a way that, we just didn't expect. And so we have to keep in mind that those unintended consequences can have significant effects on all of us. And so I have my questions regarding the drive to reestablish something that in time will be here. So it's, that's just my perspective. So, okay, thank you.
Thank you. No, that's an excellent perspective, and all your questions are very valid, and that is a very important thing to bring up. So I'll move on to you, Josh, Dr. Smith. There are many questions that came through our survey and from the fishing community focused on urchin barrens, the loss of the sunflower sea stars, and how sea otters benefit and impact coastal ecological communities. Can you lay some foundation for us by first talking about what is an urchin barren? And this was touched on a bit before, but maybe another recap on keystone species, and both how the sunflower star and the sea otter fit into the California food web.
Yeah, so there's a lot of terms there, and we've already heard several today, like keystone species, and I hope that I can unravel some of these ecological interactions. And so I'm going to use kelp forests as a way to do that. So kelp forests are one of the most productive and biologically significant ecosystems on the planet. And this extraordinary biodiversity is in part why these ecosystems are so valued for things like their economic and ecological and cultural services that they provide. But what can happen sometimes is under periods of really poor environmental conditions, things like marine heat waves that I'll talk about in a bit, or through the loss of predators, there can be what we call these sea urchin outbreaks. And so sea urchins are these grazers in kelp forests that eat the kelp. And so these sea urchin outbreaks are typically associated with the loss of those important, what we call ethosystem services. And so these outbreaks have happened around the world, and they can occur through things like marine heat waves and also through the loss of predators. But some predators, like sea otters and some sea stars, like the sunflower star, are what we call keystone species. And so they can actually help to keep populations of those sea urchins in check, thereby having an overall positive benefit on kelp forests.
Okay, excellent, thank you. And then a follow-up question to that is, can you share a bit about your research? So how did the marine heat wave of 2016 impact kelp communities in Central and Northern California, and why are we seeing a difference in kelp growth and resiliency between these two regions?
Yeah, so kelp forests over the last 10 years or so have really taken a big hit. And it's actually been now 10 years since this sea star wasting syndrome occurred that just completely decimated several different species of sea stars from Alaska to Baja. And one species that was hit particularly hard is the sunflower sea star, which is a known predator of sea urchins. The year after, so that occurred back in 2013. Then from 2014 into 2016, there was this marine heat wave that occurred, which, as I mentioned earlier, this heat wave created really poor environmental conditions for kelp productivity. And so as a result of those perturbations, what we saw up and down the coast were these sea urchin outbreaks. And in places like Sonoma and Mendocino in Northern California, these outbreaks of sea urchins were widespread. And we literally saw hundreds of kilometers of coastline become deforested. But in places like Central California, in Monterey Bay, what happened instead is that there was actually this formation of a mosaic of these emergent sea urchin barrens interspersed with these remnant patches of kelp forests that have persisted this entire time. So our research group looked into this and we were tracking sort of what was going on underwater on the reef surface with kelp and urchins, and then also looking at how this may have changed patterns in sea otter foraging and what this ultimately means for the fate of kelp forests. And so people have known this for a long time, but once these barrens develop, the condition of those sea urchins that eat the kelp really declines. And so in the kelp forest, though, the urchins are really healthy. And so that's why urchins are, of course, harvested, and their uni or their roe is what is that energetic part of the sea urchin in kelp forests. But in the barrens, these urchins are completely starved out. And you open them up and there's nothing inside of them. And it's remarkable that these animals can live in that starved state in these barrens for many, many years. And so that's what creates these challenges for kelp recovery at those places. So interestingly, it turns out that sea otters, and again, I'm talking about the Monterey Peninsula here, where this sea urchin outbreak happened in a place where otters had been pretty well established for the last several decades. And it turns out that the otters actually cued in on those really healthy urchins in the patches of kelp forests. And so otters really stepped up their foraging on sea urchins, but again, restricted to these patches of kelp. And so what that means, though, is that it seems that at least the persistence of kelp forests in Central California along the Monterey Peninsula is owed in part to this really intense sea otter foraging in those patches of kelp forests.
Thank you. Okay, that's really interesting. We're now going to head to Dr. Hughes. So piggybacking off to Dr. Smith's answer, what are some of the changes you're noticing in Northern California kelp habitats through your current research?
Okay, so yeah, my lab at Sonoma State University, we're heavily engaged in kind of these big questions of marine ecosystems and what are the key drivers of resilience and persistence. And so, and what can we as humans do about it in terms of management and restoration? So with that kind of two-pronged approach and goals for conducting our research, we know that in the last 10 years, just as Dr. Smith has mentioned, there's been an almost complete decline of kelp forest here in Northern California. And we're primarily talking about one species of kelp. This is the bull kelp, Nereocystis leucana. And it's an annual kelp. It's pretty iconic for a kelp species because it grows about a foot a day. So it has these tremendous growth rates, but like a lot of kelp, it is kind of, when urchins are not left checked by predators, it can get wiped out pretty quick. So there was about a 90% decline in kelp along the Northern California coast. And what our lab has done is not focus on those areas. We focus on the area, that 10% that still remains, because that's where we think the interesting stuff happens. And what can we learn from that? And how can we apply that to kelp forest restoration? And so what we've been finding is that without these predators around, the sea stars, sea otters, how does a kelp forest thrive in Northern California? What we've been finding is that the kelp that has persisted, a lot of it are around river mouths, estuaries, where you get a lot of freshwater flow. And oftentimes we kind of ignore estuaries, and if you're a kelp forest ecologist, you ignore the estuary, and if you're an estuary ecologist, you ignore the kelp forest. I'm this weird person who likes to work in both, and so these connections, these freshwater connections, seem to be really, really important. And what we've noticed is that these areas around these coastal confluences where we still have persistent kelp are often very, very low in urchin numbers. And we think there's something that's going on with the environmental conditions that are not very suitable for the urchins, but are very suitable for bull kelp. And bull kelp, you'll find it in very freshwater areas, especially if you go up, near Seattle and Puget Sound. It'll be very, very low salinities, and you'll find thriving kelp forests. So we've been making that connection. The second thing we're doing is that we're trying to develop restoration programs up here in Northern California, so we can be better prepared if there's another heat wave, or the sea stars never come back. What are we as humans going to be able to do about that? And so my lab, we're very focused on the vegetation side of things. And so we culture kelp in a lab. Actually, the lab is just right over there in Bodega Marine Lab. We culture the kelp. We grow it on weird things like twine. And we've been growing this kelp in the lab, growing it on twine and different surfaces like rock, where we put it back out into the ocean. So it's like underwater gardening. And we've been now with our partners, this restoration work has really expanded from Marin County to Sonoma to Mendocino. And so we are now partnering with commercial urchin divers, which kind of adds this 1-2 punch for the restoration, where the commercial urchin divers remove the urchins, and we go in there and plant them after the urchins have been removed. However, there are areas like Marin County where we're restoring kelp off the coast of Point Reyes, where we do not want to dive because we don't want to get eaten by sharks. And so what we do is we wrap our twine around bricks and throw it overboard. So, if we relate this back to the sea otter, what we know has been happening with the sea otter that has been limiting their recovery is because they can't get past these great white shark gauntlets that exist, such as around Point Reyes. And because of that, we don't, putting sea otters in an area like that with a ton of white sharks might not be the best idea for sea otter recovery. But, sea otters could do the work for us in other places where, we are doing the urchin removals. And so there could be value in that in terms of enhancing restoration. And so, I'll end there.
I have a follow-up question for you with that. So you've touched on sort of the kelp restoration work that you're doing in the different areas up along the Northern California coast. Are there any costs and benefits associated with long-term kelp restoration efforts, and sort of would sea otters hinder or assist that restoration? You maybe touched on that one just a little bit. But.
Yeah, and and so that is the deal. I think every place we're doing restoration is unique, and there's not one recipe that works for every single site. And so, like I mentioned, in Marin County, the sea otter might not work so well in that sort of restoration context because they are also fearful of white sharks, and they know when white sharks are around and will avoid those areas. They're smart animals. So an area like that, yeah, probably not much benefit from the sea otter. But these areas where it's just a loaded urchin barren, and we're trying to maybe restore new areas, the sea otter could have some value to that.
And are there long-term cost benefits to restoration of kelp through time, even just from humans versus sea otters involved?
I mean, yeah. So right now we're just trying to protect that remaining 10%, right? And we're developing strategies on how to best use our human resources to protect what is still there. We're looking at ways of maybe regenerating kelp in areas where it's been totally lost. But right now we're aiming to protect what's there and building out those areas with restoration. So, yeah.
Thank you. So now we're going to head to Dr. Tim Tinker, who I think is back up on the screen or will be shortly. There you are. Hi, Tim. When we chatted previously, you touched on how there are some misconceptions that do surround sea otter reintroduction with relation to timing. I know you just sort of touched on this with Brent as well, but I'm hoping maybe you can elaborate a little bit more on this timing of species recovery into a habitat in California specifically, since a lot of people have asked questions about Alaska in relation to that, and how the effects of sea otters on their ecological community change over time.
Right, okay, yeah, so one thing that is a lot of people, particularly people who live in coastal communities, sort of have heard about sea otters. This is communities where sea otters are not present now, but maybe either going to be reintroduced or going to spread naturally. They hear stories that sea otters are going to have these huge impacts on certain types of fisheries, particularly obviously invertebrate fisheries, whether that's for urchins, for certain types of clams or crabs. And from what we've been hearing from all the panelists, that makes sense in a way, because we know sea otters do have these disproportionately large impacts on our ecosystems. But there's a lot of variation and there's a lot of context that's important and that is sometimes glossed over. One of those contexts has to do with where the population is coming from or how it's being reintroduced. So many of, for instance, of the stories, the horror stories or the scary stories that people tell about sort of impacts of sea otters are coming from places like Southeast Alaska, where the population has built up over many, many, many decades until it's a fairly large population. And then when a group of sea otters sort of enters a new habitat or moves around a point into a new stretch of coastline, it's often a very large group of otters. Usually a group of male otters, sometimes hundreds, sometimes even into the thousands of animals that appear really suddenly. And that magnitude of sea otters, each one of them eating a quarter of their body mass a day, does have a really rapid effect on whatever prey that they're eating. And often that is sort of the largest sea urchins or certain types of prey that if there are a commercial fishery for that, they're going to have a very big impact. Now, I want to contrast that with, say, another place in Southern California where sea otters were reintroduced and where the population, they initially reintroduced population shrunk down to about 12 animals, about a dozen animals. So a small reintroduced population. And 30 years after that reintroduction, they were beginning to have an impact on certain invertebrates around part of this island. And this is a lot of people, other panelists here, have spent a lot of time on this island, San Nicolas Island. And the difference between those two scenarios is vast. And it really just has to do with how, the population size, how many otters are moving into a new area, and what the context is for that. So that context is really important and should not be glossed over. If a small number of otters were introduced into somewhere in Northern California, for instance, that population would grow over time, and eventually it would have the types of ecological effects that we've been hearing about. Some of those are going to be perceived as negative by some communities, and many of them are going to be perceived as positive by some of the same communities or different communities. They will have these effects, but they're not going to be immediate. And that's simply because of just the numbers of animals. There's not going to be suddenly 2,000 otters along the Mendocino coast. It's impossible. It is not consistent with sea otter biology. So it's important to sort of understand that context, and that these changes are going to take time depending on how many otters are reintroduced and how that and where they're reintroduced to. So is that what you were asking?
Yeah, definitely. Thank you for clarifying that. And then my follow-up with you, which is another big question, sorry, Tim. This is an area of concern, is sea otter reintroduction's impact onto the different fisheries, which you just sort of mentioned. And we do receive a lot of questions on sea otter diet preference. So are you able to touch on how sea otters might impact urchins versus abalone versus crabs versus finfish? You have some time for this one. So, and are there negative ramifications to biodiversity with a sea otter reintroduction?
Oh boy. Well, so there are many, many, many papers written.
I know.
Yeah, so those are big subjects. So certainly, I'll start with that, with a very simple statement. Sea otters have had effect on shell fisheries, on certain shell fisheries in certain areas. I just mentioned some examples in Southeast Alaska. And that's, again, a context where you have a very large population of otters spreading into new habitat. But nonetheless, it's because otters tend to eat the largest individuals of the most energetically profitable prey that are available, those are often the types of species that there are also commercial or recreational fisheries for. So that might be large sea urchins, or large geoduck clams, or large Dungeness crabs. The nature of how sea otters affect those populations, though, is different in every single case. It really depends on the natural history of those species. So I would say there's certain types of shellfish that otters can have sort of the most rapid and dramatic effects are. And Josh and Brent both just alluded to this, and that's urchins. That's because urchins tend to change their behavior dramatically when otters are present. When otters are not present, the urchins tend to be out in the open and are often grazing kelp actively. This makes them easier to find. When otters enter a system, they eat a lot of urchins, but also the urchins very rapidly change their behavior because they don't like getting eaten. And so that makes them a lot harder to find for, say, fishermen who are also targeting that species. So there are certain shellfish like that there can be a larger effect. Other things like Dungeness crab, it's a lot more complex. Otters certainly do like eating large crabs. In fact, there's some examples, and Brent's graduate work focused on an example in an estuary where otters' preference for large crabs had very important ecosystem effects. But for species like Dungeness crabs, they spend a lot of their life cycle in very deep waters that otters either can't dive to or rarely dive to. And that gives them this sort of protection, this depth protection. So otters can have effects on crabs at certain times of their life cycle when they come into shallow waters. But we haven't seen in California or other places actually evidence that otters have the ability to really have strong negative impacts on Dungeness crab fisheries. And again, it just has to do with, even though otters do like eating them, it has to do with their life cycle and their natural history. And that applies to other species as well. So you really kind of have to look on a case-by-case basis and think about the life histories involved and also sort of how otter diets change over time. This is another important thing. What otters eat when they first move into a new area is going to be very different than what they eat 10 years later or 20 years later as the ecosystem and the food web adapts to sea otters' presence. Some work done in Alaska, for instance, found that otters were initially eating commercially important shellfish in Southeast Alaska, but 20 years later, almost none of their diet contained commercially important species. They were at that point focusing on a lot of small invertebrates that occurred in kelp forests. So otter diets change over time as well. And that's another one of the sort of misunderstandings, is that what people see in the first 5 to 10 years after otters move into a new area is sort of going to define what the long term looks like. And from what we've seen, that is not the case.
Thank you. You just highlighted some of the intense complexity of all of that. So thank you so much. I'm going to go back to Richard. I think it was just sort of noted how important it is that each fishery is really unique. Can you briefly touch on how the commercial crab fishery operates, local versus large scale, and what are the average depths most commercial fishermen are fishing in?
The commercial industry, the commercial crab industry, we can vary depth-wise from 8 fathoms to 90 fathoms. It just depends. And a fathom 6 feet, so that everybody understands that. Overall impact, thinking about exactly what was just said, in that, I personally don't believe that it would be significant. I mean, the depths that the dungeons are at will probably be something, and they will learn to avoid the situation. My real question, though, I mean, I have some questions that I'd like to ask. I'm wondering why we're doing this. Why is this? What's the emphasis behind, or the impetus behind this? Regarding the kelp, it's interesting, to see, as fishermen, we've watched the kelp disappear and return, disappear and return, and the heat wave had a significant effect on that kelp. My question is, again, what is our end goal here? What are we trying to do? So, I mean, I'm kind of changing this around, I'm sorry, but,
It's okay.
I'm just at kind of a loss in some respects, because I don't really feel right now that my particular industries, the salmon, the crab, the black cod, the rockfish, I don't see that there being a large impact in this particular thing occurring, but I'm just wondering why.
Do one of you guys
Does
want
anybody
to
want to answer
answer
that?
that? I know there's going to be a big Q&A at the end too,
Right,
but do you want to start the
I'm
conversation?
I'm just at a loss.
Yeah, do you want to?
so-
Let's give it a shot.
Okay.
I think, in terms of, and I'm just going to speak from like an ecosystem perspective, and biodiversity perspective. What we've seen happen in the last, well, if we include the history, the loss of, an iconic predator. Now we have the loss of, if you can consider the sunflower star an iconic predator, which a lot of people do in California, there's another one, and then almost a total deforestation event. And so for us as ecologists, we look at this and you might step back and be like, well, is this an extinction event? Like what do we call this event, and what do we do to, do what we can right now to stop, any further destruction, and then think about the future in terms of climate change and what Northern California might look like in 20 or 30 years. And I think it comes down to like, well, what do we want it to look like? And for me, as putting the conservation biologist hat on, it's, having sustainable fisheries. And I think we've been mentioning the coexistence of humans from different various groups, and, hopefully a thriving kelp forest. And, I think a lot of people might look at the kelp forest here and not think much of it because it's underwater. But it's what I tell my students, like, well, let's pretend somebody just went out and clear cut all the redwood trees right now. It's pretty similar in my mind. But I'm one person, one perspective, so I'm not going to carry on with this. But that's just kind of my viewpoint.
Well, Thank you, Brent, and thank you for asking that question. I do think that maybe at the end, Tracy, I know that there's cards, maybe there's a way to kind of bring that question back up to the whole panel, because I think everyone will be able, not just one panelist, but all the panelists. That would be great, so we can make sure that discussion happens. No, I think that's an excellent question. So it'll be good, though, to have all the panelists up here, so that way everyone can have that big discussion together. And then I'm going to go back to Dr. Smith. So you touched on how sea otters have helped to dampen the effects of kelp loss and reduce urchin variants in regions with sea otters like Monterey. But we do have Northern California communities wondering, why is there still some kelp loss in Central California? If sea otters were to be reintroduced into Northern California, how might this impact kelp resiliency, even if there's potential for future marine heat waves?
So the greatest amount of kelp loss in Central California occurred during the marine heat wave from 2014 into 2016. And then it continued for a few years after that. I think it's like, that's not particularly surprising. I mean, there's no reason to believe that ecological communities should recover overnight to this extreme environmental event that occurred. We've continued to see kelp forest loss. However, I do want to emphasize that at least in Central California, there are these remnant patches of kelp forests that have persisted this entire time. And what's so important about that is thinking about the eventual recovery of the system. That kelp, or replenishing those barrens with kelp, that source kelp has to come from somewhere. So on the Central Coast, where there's this mosaic of sea urchin barrens and these remnant patches of kelp forests, those remnant patches of kelp forests are the ultimate spore sources to help replenish those barren grounds. The other thing too that I thought of that I think Tim mentioned this earlier, and I think it comes up to the previous question, it sort of addresses the previous question, is that contexts are really important. And Northern California is similar but different in ways than Central California. These are traditionally bull kelp dominated forests. In Central California, we're talking about macrocystis, which is a different kind of kelp. We heard a bit about San Nicolas Island earlier. What's really interesting about Central California is this may be one of a few examples of where an urchin outbreak happened at a location where sea otters were pretty well established. But again, that response by the sea otters to target urchins in patches of kelp forests helped to facilitate the resistance of those kelp forests to further overgrazing by sea urchins. There's yet one more example of the opposite of this up in the Aleutian Islands, where after otters were hunted from these islands, the urchins took over because they no longer had a predator and transformed these islands into these barrens. But then once otters recovered to those islands, they ate the urchins and the kelp came back. So those, I think, are a couple examples that we can draw from of sort of both sides of the coin of how an urchin outbreak happened in a place where there were sea otters, and also how sea otters influenced the recovery of a forest by repatriating an area that they were hunted from.
Thank you. And then Dr. Hughes, we're going to go back to you. Sort of with just discussing resiliency, I'd also like to talk a little bit about climate change and how a keystone species like sea otters can dampen some of these effects. And can you also touch on how sea otters influence salt marshes and eelgrass communities? You mentioned that's an area that you like to research as well. How do sea otters use estuaries? In what ways do they impact surrounding ecological communities?
Yeah, so it turns out that the majority of this discussion today has been on kelp forests, but we also know that sea otters like to use estuaries too, and that they can play these really important roles in the estuary, in particular protecting other types of vegetation like seagrass in salt marshes. And a lot of, the general public doesn't think so much about seagrasses. Again, it's this habitat that you can't really see. So you don't even know it's there, but it's, they kind of create these mini kelp forests almost. and they're really important for fisheries. They're nursery habitats, and so the little baby fish that go offshore and the Dungeness crab, they spend their time in estuaries before they move out. And so what we've been finding is that sea otters play a keystone role in seagrass beds and potentially salt marshes as well. And it's through a totally different pathway that does not even involve urchins at all. It really involves crabs and a little bit of clams. And so what we're finding is that by sea otters eating Dungeness-like crab, like red rock crabs that you find in estuaries, it generates this cascade of events where you get healthier, more thriving seagrass beds. And we've seen this not only in California, Central California, but we've started to see these patterns emerge in Alaska, British Columbia, and where sea otters are spending a lot of time in the kelp forest, but also they're spending a lot of time in the seagrass beds. And the seagrass beds and also the salt marshes, in the estuary themselves can provide this really important refugia. So when things go bad on the outer coast, be it great white sharks, killer whales, heat waves, big storm events, the estuaries seem to provide this really, really important refuge for the sea otter. And as we're kind of, the sea otter here, at least in California, has been benefiting to some degree from protection in certain areas, like marine protected areas, where we're seeing them actually expand out. And Chairman Sarris isn't here, but his story about the sea otters moving up rivers, it's actually very consistent to what we're seeing now. With their protection, we're seeing them move up into brackish water areas far away from the ocean, tens of kilometers away from the ocean, moving onto salt marshes, hauling out, eating all the little crabs in the salt marsh, which these crabs that live in the salt marsh, if they're not checked by predators, they'll eat the actual roots of the salt marsh, and then they'll burrow in the salt marsh and create kind of the Swiss cheese effect in the marsh, which really makes the marsh susceptible to erosion and the effects of sea level rise. And so this is kind of newer information, we think the sea otter might actually play a really important role there. And so I think the point here is that there are these other ecosystems and habitats that are probably just as important as the kelp forest is for the sea otter. And these habitats, there are plenty of them up here in Northern California, such as Bodega Bay right here. Yeah.
Wonderful. Thank you, Brent. We only have a couple minutes, but Tim, I do have one last question for you. So we just sort of talked about two different habitat types, and habitat and site selection is incredibly important with any potential reintroduction. What makes a potential reintroduction site appropriate for a sea otter, and how do you determine this? Are there criteria? Are you there, Ted?
I'm here.
There you are.
Oh, there I am. Yeah, so that's a great question, another complex one. And I guess the criteria depend a lot on what Dick raised. What are the goals of a reintroduction? So if one were reintroducing, say, sea otters with the goal of having, say, positive ecological effects in estuaries, then one would be looking at estuaries as potential release sites. Another one of the criteria that people look at is wanting to make sure that if there is a reintroduction, that it's successful, in the sense that you don't spend a lot of time and effort and money reintroducing sea otters, and then the population goes extinct in 10 years. So viability of the actual reintroduced sea otter population is another one of the criteria that the people would like to look at. And we can do a lot of work with modeling, because we have a lot of information on the relative sea otter abundance and population dynamics in different types of habitats. So we can run simulations, for instance, in an estuary or a stretch of open coast, based on what we know about the habitat, about the different prey species that are present, to compare different potential sites in terms of their likelihood of supporting a sustainable population of sea otters. But I reiterate that's just one of the criteria, and I think as a number of the speakers have been sort of raising this point that we really should not or do not want to be looking at this as sort of a single species sort of challenge. It's really a much more holistic ecosystem or socio-ecological sort of project that's being considered. And that being the case, many of the criteria that should be looked at will be potential ecological benefits and also potentially minimizing negative social or economic impacts of sea otters. So, for instance, if you knew that there was a particular type of fishery that might be negatively impacted by sea otters that was centered, on a certain stretch of coast, one might want to avoid having that be the location of a reintroduction. So really, there's a suite of different criteria ranging from sort of the cultural, the socio-economic, to the ecological, the types of ecological effects that sea otters have and where they may be beneficial to people in different types of habitats, and then finally sort of those demographic criteria, where are we most likely to see a viable population of sea otters over the long term, and also there's sort of broader demographic ones as well, and that has to do with reestablishing genetic connectivity between southern sea otters and northern sea otters, which currently the southern range edge of northern sea otters is in near the south end, or getting closer to the south end of Washington State. And then there's this big stretch of no sea otters until you get to right now about Half Moon Bay or Pigeon Point, where you pick up the distribution of southern sea otters. And that massive break is sort of, it's completely broken any potential genetic connectivity. And as a result, southern sea otters have a very low level of genetic diversity. And reestablishing that demographic connectivity of populations over the long term, we're not talking about next year or the next 10 years, but reestablishing that is going to be very important from sort of a broader scale conservation perspective of reestablishing not only the ecological effects of sea otters, but also the genetic demographic connectivity that will allow it to have healthy, genetically diverse populations over the longer term.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Tim. I believe our time is up, so I would like to thank all of the panelists from this panel, and to remind everyone, if there were questions that didn't quite get to, you want to be asked, make sure you can add them onto the sheet that's at the center of the table. Thank you all.
So we are going to rewind about 2 hours. And those of you who know me know that I often am the kind of person who just jumps right in and tries to start getting to business. So I realized that I never actually introduced myself earlier. Hi, my name is Linda Hopkins. I am the 5th District Supervisor for the County of Sonoma, and it is my honor and privilege to represent all 55 miles of the gorgeous Sonoma coastline. And as I described earlier, I am very honored to have the opportunity to work in partnership with 2 tribes on the Sonoma coast. You heard from Chairman Sarris earlier, and I am pleased to report that Chairman Franklin actually is able to join us today, and so he will be giving a welcome and a little bit of information about not only the Kashaya people, but also sort of the history with respect to otters on the North Sonoma coast. I have learned so much from Chairman Franklin. He has taught me, I have so much still to learn, and yet he really embodies the commitment of literally tens of thousands of years of stewardship of land and community. And we are extraordinarily lucky to have him at the local level. I happen to know that DC keeps trying to pull him away from Sonoma County, but his heart is in his home and his homeland, and he is a tremendous advocate and representative, not only for the Kashaya people, but really everyone who has the opportunity to come to the Sonoma coast. And I do want to say, you have daughters, so you know how how this goes. My 10-year-old doesn't think very much of what I do as cool, but she went to Fort Ross and learned, and she thought it was very cool that I could know you and consider you a friend. So thank you for that bonus to my 10-year-old daughter. Please welcome and join me in a round of applause for Chairman Franklin. Thank you so much.
Do you want me at the table or the podium? You got the pulpit. Oh, yes, right on. I got the pulpit. I'm going to preach. Hope y'all are ready. Great. Well, always good to see you. It's always good to be back home. I've been in the last 4 weeks, 5 weeks in Connecticut, back to DC, and then up in Alaska, down to Phoenix, which technically is hell as far as I'm concerned. And then over to Oklahoma and then Kansas, and then got back here Tuesday. So pardon for being a little tardy, but my life is crazy, and that's just the way it goes when you're a tribal chairman and health board chair and do all the things that I'm asked to do on behalf of the country and the president, as well as Indian country. So, Hen Maya Iwa, Toshish Jima, and Reno County Franklin, tribal chairman of the Kashaya Pomo tribe. Obama appointee to the Advisory Council on Historic Preservation, a post that I am still in on my third administration, which is kind of weird. And as my good friend said, also a father of daughters, twin daughters, who are 16 and do nothing but judge their father. So, yeah, you know, this is something that's a little more close to the heart for me. And I'm going to talk a little bit about a Kashaya perspective of you know, Kamos Washke is our word for our little sea otters, which are good friends of ours. But first, I want to address one question, and the question was asked, why now and why are we doing this? And my entire talk is going to be about why now and why we're going to do this, not why should we do this, because Kashaya will do it. In 1812, we had our first experience with non-Indian people. Kashaya's lands are just that, very strict about our land. And the ceremonies that we do, unlike our brothers and sisters up in the north, we don't do world healing ceremonies. What Yurok does for Yurok is awesome. What they do for the rest of us is even better. But Kashaya religion doesn't allow that, and that we can't dictate for others what is sacred, and in turn, nobody dictates for Kashaya what is sacred. So we are not allowed to do the world perspective the way some of these other tribes do. So to have these people come, the undersea people, which, you know, if you can imagine looking out at that ocean for thousands and thousands of years, that nice straight line, and all of a sudden, in the distance, you see something getting bigger and bigger and bigger. What in the hell is that? I mean, what are these people? What is this foolish language they're speaking to us? You know, and it was the Russians coming up, and with them came the Alaska Natives. So why are we going to introduce otters on my coast now? Because the Russians came, and they hunted our otters into extinction in Kashaya's lands. And they were aggressive. They came down here and wiped out for Gregr and the Coast Miwok people some of the best clam beds in the entire world, just completely wiped them out. And why now is a question that's important with an answer that's even more important. Why now is because for 150 or so years, the Kashaya people harbored resentment towards the Alaska Native people. After the Russians were here for around 40 or so years, Kashaya signed a treaty. We allowed them to build the fort there, Fort Ross, on our village of Matini. And, you know, their purpose for coming down, like everybody else, was how am I going to make money off this land and off this ocean? And sea otters were up. They were up, you know. They tried hay, and Kashaya people would get really tired of the Russians and just burn their hay down. You know, and they tried, you know, breeding horses and that kind of stuff, and we'd get tired of the Russians and kill their horses. And, you know, it's something you can do when there's 24,000 of you and about 200 of them. That's just numbers game, right? So, unfortunately, the sea otters were the ones that suffered. And with that, left a huge hole in Kashia's culture, our way of life, our life ways. And like I said, we were upset, rightfully so, at these Alaska Natives that came down as the hunters, as the hitmen, so to speak, for these little otters that are out there playing around. Wasn't a good time to be an otter. In about 2012, the Alaska Natives contacted us, and when they left, they married into our tribe. So we have several Kashia people that married Russians and married Alaska Natives and went back home with them. So in about 2012, they contacted us, and they asked us if they could come and put on an event at our village. And so initially, we were kind of reluctant. You otter killing mofos. Now you want to come back and, like, how dare? But they're good people, and they asked in the right way. Let's just say that. So we met them down there just at the fort right there on the water, and they came in and they're paddled in and asked for permission to come ashore, and we granted it, and it started an era of communication between the two of us. We didn't know that the Russians actually had forced them to come down and held their families, and if they didn't meet their quotas, would murder their families back up in Alaska. And the reason why they had to do the things they did to our otter population and our clan population and several others was because if they didn't, those Russians would murder their families, murder their kids, murder their wives, rape and pillage the same way that these missions did. So we forgave them. And with forgiveness comes goodness. So we forgave them shortly after that. Things that were prophesied in Kashia started to come to fruition. First, with that forgiveness, a year later, our elk returned. We didn't tell anybody because we love the non-native families that live by us, the Richardsons. These guys might as well be Kashia people at this point, They've known us forever. But there's some yahoos out there with guns that we were like, we better keep the elk quiet so nobody goes out and kills it. So that guy came down, he went back home, he picked up his 20 favorite wives, and he came back down. Next thing you know, we have an elk herd living right next to or actually partially on our trust land on the reservation. Porcupines came back. Burrowing owls came back, much to the displeasure of the local farmers who we like and know and love. The badgers came back and started eating their sheep. But, if they weren't tasty, they wouldn't get eaten. So there was a number of land animals that started to come back. So why now? Why now, Jared? Why now goes back to forgiveness. Why now goes back to prophecy. Shortly after that, Kashia got our coastal land back, something that you took part in, and named it the Kashia Coastal Reserve. We have a mile of oceanfront property, goes into the ocean, goes all the way up to the ridge top, and we've decided to use that as a way to gauge our ocean health and how to better invest our tribal traditional knowledge, pair it with that scientific knowledge, and get away from the friction that exists between science and culture and find ways to bridge that gap. And we've done that very successfully at the Coastal Reserve. And in the pattern of forgiveness and the pattern of things that are meant to be, all of a sudden we're having this conversation, which started a few years ago for us. And while we've put our attention on the above forest, the below forest is no different for us. You see, in Kashia way, we have this thing, it's called the law of reciprocity. Kashia Tawi, the cultural law that binds you, us, and all other things to our earth and our lands here along the Sonoma coast. And Kashia Tawi teaches us that for what is given, something is taken. For what is taken, something is given. And all these things go to that law of reciprocity into the before world, where Kashia people sat with all the other beings and decided who's going to come down to this earth, who goes first, what's our purpose for going there. So we came down, and the plant people, the plant beings, said, we'll give our lives for you. Whether we're above ground or below ground, it made no difference. In the water, out of the water, makes no difference. They'll give their lives for all of us to give us nourishment, to give us ceremony, to give us healing. The rock beings did the same thing. We'll give you shelter. We'll mark areas where I think you all, or some of you call them vortexes. But in Kashaya, we would say it's a power place, it's a way up place. It's a place that we would go for prayer and ceremony. And those rock beings did that for us. And then the animals did that. Every single one of them, from the littlest to the biggest animal, did that exact thing, said, we'll give our lives for you. But in return, you Kashaya people will do this. You will honor us with ceremony. You will honor us when you take our lives. You won't take our lives for no reason at all. You'll take it in a good way. And then every year, here are the ceremonies that will make Kashaya people give you the ability to make these things whole, to make this forest whole, to make these waters whole, to make these plants and the winged and the two-leggeds and everything else around us whole. And so we've been doing that. We've been doing that, but we've been missing some of these pieces. So why do this now? So there's a good question that gentleman asked from the fisheries. I have opinions on fisheries and fishermen, but I happen to be a fisherman myself, and I'm Hawaiian too, so I'll eat anything that comes out of that water. But why now? Because Kashaya says it's time. Because no matter what it is that the scientific world does, it's nothing without the cultural side, without the cultural world that we provide. It's like we're your big brother and it's time. And we're telling you, I'm telling you, on behalf of the Kashaya Pomo people, it's time. Do it. Heck, we got 1.5 miles of ocean up there. It's beautiful. Bring it to our land. We'll host you. Bring it to us first. We want it first in Kashaya. No disrespect to Greg. He probably wants it first here. And I think he could beat me if we were in a race running, but I could probably beat him in tic-tac-toe or something. So if we had to bet Indian way, I'm sure one way or the other, Kashaya may come out on top on that. But yeah, we're ready for it. Bring it up to us. Our river otters, they thrive. I know the first time I saw a river otter on the land, I was just like, what in the hell is wrong with you, boy? Just kind of going along, and he was going up 2 miles. If anybody knows Plantation, some of you do. I know you do. They were going up to Plantation to go get the fish because that thing knew they had just restocked it. And I'm like, damn. Are they paying attention to tail numbers on helicopters? Like, how does this otter? Are they this smart? And yeah, it's time. We're ready for it. Ceremonially, Kashaya is ready for it. And that took a long time. That took more than 100 years to get to a place with the Alaska Natives where we forgive each other. And I had seen some of the smaller otters down in Monterey Bay. And I just told y'all I was just up in Alaska. One of the places I was at was Homer. I've never seen that big of a sea otter before. And I get it now. A gentleman was talking about the difference between the southern otters and the northern otters. I didn't know there were blood and crip otters, but apparently there are. And having seen both of them, holy, those things are huge, and my God, our kelp forest needs it. And there's a big part of this balance. My family, we're from Sine Achakawali, and that's a village that is in Kashaya's lands. But the other village that we're from is Dukashal. And it's frustrating because that literally translates into Abaloneville. And it's been tough not being able to go out and get abalone the way that we do, and it's such a staple in our ceremonial and our subsistence life. And I've got elders that are side-eyeing me, and I know that I'm not doing enough. So, anything that helps the forest, the kelp forest, the scientific side of me of why now says because that biodiversity is important, because every little thing in that side that ocean, it all contributes to the overall health of the ocean. And we found out the hard way. You found out the hard way. Kashaya found out the hard way that when you pull the leg out from underneath the chair, it gets real unsturdy. And that's exactly what's happened to our ocean with the stripping of our kelp. Man, that's tough to see. And we'll go down at Stewart's Point where you used to be able to just rock pick, and the abalone were so abundant. And nothing's hunting those urchins, man. They're just middle fingering us. You, me, all of us. They're not afraid of anything. They just destroyed those kelp beds. It's real sad to see. And I remember when on the first big storm that came, seeing hundreds of abalone washed up on the beach, and just so much kelp. That's a normal thing, but that kelp, it was roots. It was the roots, and we were thinking, oh no, something's not right. Something's not right. And then here we are 15 years later, and we're trying to fix it. So, I appreciate the opportunity to talk to y'all about Kashia's history, our perspective, a little bit about our cultural law. It's good to see a lot of friendly faces in here, a lot of folks that I know and worked with, state parks guys that just don't get enough credit for all the hard work they do, and our supervisor who is doing everything that you can and doing it well, and I appreciate that. So, and then of course I get to pick on Jared a little bit because that's my guy over there. He's going to fix all this, and he's going to fund whatever we want. So you guys get your funding requests in as soon as you can. Thank you. If there's any questions, happy to answer. No, my life. Yeah, because I have to run. I'd love to stay, but y'all, my life's crazy. I barely made it here. Sorry. But technically, I'm never gone, right? So it's Kashia lands.
Any questions from members of the public? I think that you stunned everyone into silence, which is a good thing.
Oh, it's cool.
Yes.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, everybody.
Chairman. We are so lucky to have such wonderful tribal leadership representing the entirety of the Sonoma Coast. And I think that it's safe to say that we sort of, I guess, what is it, like bat well above our average or sort of punch above our weight range with respect to Sonoma County being, a relatively small county and a very large country. And yet we have tremendous advocacy occurring at the national level in the top tiers of government, thanks to Chairman Franklin's leadership. So thank you so much for everything that you do for all of us. And thank you for coming out here today. I really, really appreciate it. I'm about to introduce yet another fantastic champion of the coast. And not just this coast, but the coast all the way to the Oregon border, correct? Yes. And before I introduce Congressman Huffman, I do want to acknowledge that I think this is a really unprecedented appearance of local, state, federal, and tribal partners here in Sonoma County. And in addition to myself, we actually have county leadership, both from Mendocino as well as Marin. And so I wanted to acknowledge Supervisors Rice and Rodoni from Marin and Supervisor Williams from Mendocino. One thing that we have been told by the scientists is that sea otters often don't stay where you put them. And so it is critical to have a regional partnership that is really sort of strong, particularly at the local level. We also actually have two seated coastal commissioners, and we're joined earlier this morning by a former coastal commissioner. So I wanted to acknowledge Commissioner Hart and Commissioner Rice, who play a critical role in sort of the statewide representation. And Sonoma County is actually, I believe, going to be the first county to move forward a local coastal plan to the California Coastal Commission that includes support for reintroduction for sea otters actually as part of their LCP. And I wanted to acknowledge that previously we had Sarah Almanzada, who is Deputy Secretary for California Natural Resources. And we also have representatives from every single one of our local state legislators. That would be Assemblymember Wood, Senator McGuire, Assemblymember Connolly. So thank you for your participation. And now, without further ado, I think that we have one of the absolute, this is, not hyperbole, this is actually a deserved superlative, most ardent environmental leaders in the country who works on behalf of Northern California. He has brought so much to our coast, not only in terms of critical resources for restoration and rehabilitation of our offshore marine ecosystems, but also in terms of protective legislation and advocacy to really steward our natural resources. In addition, I think that he is one of the legislators who has the highest priority on tribal partnerships and working directly with tribes to advance environmental initiatives and also uplift Indigenous knowledge. So thank you so much, Congressman Huffman, for taking time out of your insanely busy schedule to join us here today. And without further ado, please join me in a round of applause for Congressman Huffman. Do you want the podium or do you want to?
Maybe I'll just speak here. All right. Well, Supervisor Hopkins, I think you deserve a round of applause for pulling this group together and having this forum. I am just so impressed with what you have pulled together here today, and I'm so honored to be part of it. Every now and then, we have a chance to do something that just makes a lot of sense, that rights a wrong, that makes things better. And I am convinced, and we can talk a little more about why that is, but I am convinced that bringing back sea otters to the North Coast is one of those things. So I have had the chance to be briefed by federal officials who've been studying the feasibility of this, and I have come to believe that the science is strong. The case for doing this is super solid, and the timing is right. So I think it's important that we start to have this conversation. And Supervisor, you're doing it in the right way. I'm so impressed with the different folks that you've brought into this conversation. This is exactly the right way to go, and I'm also really proud that at least two of the tribes I represent are right here, fired up, ready to go as partners. Thanks, Chair Franklin, for your enthusiasm and your passion and your vision. But I represent Indian country all the way to the Oregon border, and I will tell you that I've got tribes all the way up in Humboldt and Del Norte County that are excited about this too. And we've got some successful co-management wins to build on as a foundation for how we might be able to do this in a really new and different and an exciting way. I'm thinking in particular of the way that the Yurok tribe has partnered with the federal and state and local officials on the successful reintroduction of the California condor. So I just think all the pieces are in place, but I also understand that we've got to bring everybody along here. And let me just reveal one of my biases in this conversation. Not only am I an environmentalist and really excited about bringing back a keystone species like the sea otter, I could wonk out with all of you about the science of keystone species and why this is such a fascinating and compelling story. But I also like to fish. In fact, I've fished right here out of Bodega Bay many times. I like to catch and eat fish. And, whether it's rockfish, lingcod, whatever I can pull out off the coast here, or salmon when they'll let us, when they leave a little water in the rivers and allow us to catch salmon. That's another story. Or even on my kayak up in the Sea Ranch, pulling lingcod out. I love to do that. And I am convinced that restoring sea otters is going to be great for fishing. Okay? And I know that for some that might be a little bit counterintuitive. So we've really got to explain how bringing back an animal which at first blush, likes to eat fish like all of us, might seem to be a little bit of a threat to those who like to catch rockfish and lingcod and salmon and other things. But I am also convinced that when you look at the big picture and the full story, Chairman Franklin, you talked about Stewart's Point and what's going on out there with the kelp forest and the urchins. I think everyone will come to see that bringing back sea otters is even a great thing for those like me who like to catch fish. So I am just super excited about all of this. I am so pleased that I get to represent this entire North Coast area that stands to benefit, I think, in just about every way from the reintroduction of sea otters. And I'm really grateful for all of you, especially you, Supervisor Hopkins, in having the leadership to bring this together. So count on me. I'm here for the long haul. We're doing everything we can right now to try to bring back the kelp forests. We are bringing some new resources to the table to support the Friends group at the Greater Farallones National Marine Sanctuary and other folks who are working on some interventions to try to bring kelp back. But the reintroduction of the sea otter is one of those interventions that can not only help the kelp forest, but bring back some balance to this coastal ecosystem so that as climate change continues to throw curveballs at us, we will have a stronger, more resilient ecosystem that's ready to withstand that. So I'm happy to answer any questions you might have, but just really grateful to see all of you and super excited about next steps to actually make this happen. All right.
So we will pass the microphone around for questions. And since Chairman Franklin is still here and maybe could stay for at least another 5 or 10 minutes, also if you have questions after sort of mulling this over for Chairman Franklin or Congressman Huffman, please feel free to ask. So if you raise your hand, we will run around with the microphone, and you might have to duck behind the podium because I don't know if we have an extra mic. But please go ahead and raise your hands if you have any questions. And while we're waiting for the brave person to take the first step, I'd also want to acknowledge that really one of the reasons that this summit exists at all are conversations that I have had with Chairman Franklin, but also the leadership of Congressman Huffman. It was actually Congress that funded the study that I found out about from Brock Dolman of the Occidental Arts and Ecology Center that led to us reaching out to other stakeholders, and the momentum just grew because all of you are here for a reason, for a passion, for a desire for restoration. So thank you all for being here, and thank you so much for your leadership because we wouldn't be here truly without you.
I'll repeat the first question that came up earlier, and it was why introduction and why now?
Well, am I working? Yeah. So introduction, as I understand it from the conversations I've had with the folks who know the science, is going to be necessary because the populations in Monterey Bay, Santa Cruz, are just unable to expand their range north, I think due to shark predation. And so we're going to have to bring them up here. And once we do that, I think there's every reason to believe that they would establish here and hopefully extend their range even further north. Did that answer your question?
Thank you, yes. Yeah. Are there other questions? Happy to pass. Sure.
Hi, I'm Tara Duggan with the San Francisco Chronicle, and it sounds like there's a lot of momentum. Just the last two of you spoke about a desire for this to happen. Can you talk a little bit about what it would take for it to happen, next steps?
Yeah, and so we should probably bring the Fish and Wildlife Service into this to talk about the technical things that, here we go, what do you know, on cue, Lilian's here. But look, the Endangered Species Act has a mechanism for reintroducing species that have been extirpated in ways that help to avoid conflicts. Some people may be concerned about that. Are they gonna get hit with an ESA take violation for, going fishing, or a Marine Mammal Protection Act violation for coming within a certain proximity of these critters? I'm going to let you answer all those tough questions. There's a way to do it. The law envisions all of that. But in terms of timing and why now, I think this kelp forest die-off has been a huge wake-up call to the entire North Coast, that something is out of whack. And climate change is throwing curveballs at us with changing ocean conditions. This is a moment where bringing this keystone predator back into the North Coast ecosystem can be very responsive to those challenges that we're facing.
So the process is a multi-year, multi-step process. And so as I mentioned when I was up here earlier, we're really in the very beginning stages. We're hearing from people, and we're literally consulting with people. We don't have a proposal. We don't have a plan. We're at the ground floor right now. So what would happen is later this summer, we're having some open houses where we're traveling up and down the North Coast from Oregon, starting in Astoria and ending in Emeryville. I'm hearing from communities, hearing from people like you, that either want sea otters, or you have concerns, or you have environmental issues that sea otters might help to solve for you. We just want to hear from everyone. And then from there, we'll decide whether we want to put forth a proposal. And in the background, Dr. Tim Tinker and people from Monterey Bay Aquarium are working on developing models of what habitat would be suitable, what population growth would be like, and we want to hear from the public about what the socio-economic criteria are in each place and how we would measure those criteria, how you think we should best measure them. And then we're going to put it all together in Tim's magic math machine, and we're going to perhaps come out with some alternatives. But at every step of the way, there's an off-ramp that says, no, we're going to stop. And so we have to be convinced, okay, well, we're going to continue to the next step. And so then ultimately, if we put forth a formal proposal, then we go through the NEPA process, National Environmental Policy Act. So we would do scoping, meaning something like this, where we get everyone's thoughts about what the important issues are. Then we do a scoping report. We formulate potential alternatives. We put out a draft environmental impact statement. We have a public comment period. We have hearings. We take everyone's input. We put out a final environmental impact statement, and then we decide what to do. And one of those options would be a no action alternative, and then there would be several options. And then after that, then we could maybe start actually doing something with otters, but then as we've heard, that also takes time. So this is not something that happens instantly, but it's a long process, and so if we want it to happen, we do need to start it right away. And so this is the first conversation along that path.
I'm going to jump in because I actually have a question, which is I'm wondering if you, as well as Chairman Franklin, could touch on opportunities for tribal co-management.
Is that for me, Supervisor?
Yeah, for all, and I think Chairman Franklin, if you got one.
Sure. Yeah. So I think this is a perfect candidate for tribal co-management. I don't want to speak for the Fish and Wildlife Service, but they did a beautiful job up in the northern part of my district with the California condor reintroduction, and that was such a close partnership between the Fish and Wildlife Service, both the National Park Service and California State Parks, and the Yurok tribe. And I think that could be the exact model to build on for the sea otter, but what do you think?
Yeah, so I think probably they're telling me to go up front, so I didn't want to do that, but here I am. Yeah, Yurok definitely started a process. I envision it looking a little different. You know, you look at like co-management between tribes on the plains and buffalo, and in every one of those, there's a tribal take and a protection for that. And hey, man, you know, Kashaya people haven't used our sea otter in ceremony or in ceremonial regalia for 150 years. And so how do we incorporate that very important cultural component into what this looks like with sea otters and our ability to use that, you know? And I know that Yurok did something similar. I don't know if I'm supposed to talk about it. I think they did something similar with feathers, and that was appropriate for that tribe. And so I think that with this ocean management and with this co-management opportunity we have for our little sea friends, that it opens up some doors for some discussions that I think will be very unique, just as unique as Sonoma County people are. No disrespect to Marin and Mendocino, now that I know you're here. And hey, Carol, I love you. It's good to see you as well. But you know, but we are unique in a better, awesomest way that I like to brag about, because we're at West County, Sonoma, and it's where the world started. And that's a very Kashaya-centric point of view. And as chairman, I like to make sure everybody knows that's the way we think. So co-management, yeah, there's an opportunity there. And it'll be neat and interesting to see what it looks like. I happen to have brought some otter back with me, oddly enough, for some of our traditional people to use, and had to go up to Alaska and pay for that, both ceremonial way and then other ways. So it'd be nice to do that with our own otters for a change.
Yeah, so the Marine Mammal Protection Act has an exemption for subsistence use by coastal Alaskan natives, but that's limited to Alaska. So in the lower 48, there is no such exemption. But here's an idea for people who make laws. I'm not allowed to talk to them, so I'm going to look this way. In California, we have a very robust stranding response program where we pick up all the dead sea otters that are reported, we do necropsies on them, and we have lots and lots of sea otter parts. And because we have so many people in California, we find those otters right away a lot of the time. And so we have some very freshly dead otters with beautiful pelts. And so I think it would be fantastic if we did something that's similar to the Bald and Golden Eagle Act, where there's a feather repository. We could have an otter part repository. And nothing would make me happier than to have those parts from incidentally dead sea otters that have received a necropsy, and we save those parts and we distribute them to tribes who want to use them for cultural purposes. And so as far as I know, we don't have a mechanism for that. We might need to talk to our lawyers and see if there's anything that currently exists in the MMPA that allows it. Several years ago, we looked into this. It might have been your request that prompted us to look into this. And we were told, to our immense frustration, that there was no mechanism for it. So I think a little sentence thrown in there might make a big difference.
Somebody just gave me a good bill idea, so I appreciate that very much.
You have my support on that, by the way. Yeah. We have a comedy show tonight. If you go to, we'll be back at 8 o'clock. No, but no, the Alaska thing's bigger than that. It's not just subsistence. It's also that depending on the island or the part of Alaska, only certain Alaska Native tribes are allowed to work with sea otters in a certain way. Only an Alaska Native person from those particular areas, like what's Kodiak Island, only they're allowed to work on certain things, and that extends to walrus tusks and across the board. And so I think that when we're looking for that opportunity for co-management and defining what that is, that all of those aspects are put in there too, because we still have traditional people that know how to use and work with, that sea otter pelt. And so, I kind of, it's not like, all of a sudden, like, there's an otter, yay, let's go cut it up and do something stupid. There's very strict rules culturally to how Kashaya people can interact with, different species, including otters. And so we still have that knowledge, that traditional knowledge exists within our tribe all these generations later, and that's because of amazing people like S.E. Parrish, who protected that knowledge and said that someday that's going to come back to the tribe, and my responsibility, and then now your responsibility, and passed it down, was to make sure that when those things came back, that Kashaya people were ready. And so that's a big thing too. And why now? Because we're ready still.
I'll bring you a mic. 1 second.
Hi, so I'm Karen Gear with State Coastal Conservancy, and I just wanted to make sure that everybody in this room was aware that right now we have a request for proposals available for sea otter projects. It's a small pot of money. It's money that comes through the state tax checkoff. We have a couple $100,000. The proposals are due in July, mid-July, but if you go on our website, scc.ca.gov, you can see the request for proposals. And as I'm listening to this conversation, I'm thinking that there could be some, portion of a study or something that could help further this discussion that you all might want to think about applying for. So.
One thing comes to mind, Karen. I don't know if it's this or if you all have talked about this before I got here, but the potential tourism windfall of bringing back the sea otter, needs to be part of this conversation. I mean, anyone who's ever been to Elkhorn Slough and gone out on kayaks and just seen what this does, I mean, people come from all over the place to be out among the sea otters. It is big business that could be really great for this entire North Coast.
Mary Callahan with the Press Democrat. I'm wondering if someone could address how the otters would be reintroduced in terms of the supply of otters that would be moved. As I understand, there are about 3,000 southern sea otters, and I'm wondering what that would mean for the existing population, or whether there might be other options.
Yeah, so as I mentioned, we're in the very early stages, so we don't know what otters might be used, but options are to use wild sea otters from the southern sea otter range. And if you're taking sea otters from areas where they're at or near carrying capacity, you're not really having an impact on that donor population because you're taking away some of the competition from the otters that are remaining there. So that's one option, but we know from past experience that there's really high attrition of otters that are moved from one place to the next because they have a very strong site fidelity. And so about 90% would be expected to leave if the same methods are used that were used in the past. Another option would be to do some modification of that, and people are currently discussing what modifications could be done with reintroduced wild sea otters. Then the Monterey Bay Aquarium, and you'll be hearing from a representative of theirs later, they've been doing this amazing program of rehabilitating stranded, orphaned, wild sea otter pups. They raise them under human, well, not really under human care, under the care of surrogate mother sea otters. So these are non-releasable adult female sea otters that take the pup under their wing and teach them some things, and then those juveniles are later released. And they have, it's a very intensive process, but it's a very successful process as well. But those are small numbers of sea otters. So there's a lot of questions about what otters would be used. Would it be some combination? Would there be any northern sea otters involved, or would it be all southern sea otters, our threatened subspecies? Those are all questions that have yet to be decided.
We have time for one last question.
Okay. We'll give you a dozen. We'll give you a baker's dozen.
They're incredibly cute.
This should be really quick. You know, I'm just interested in, you know, I can see the animals making it very well in the bay, in the estuaries and things. What I'm curious about is the scientific end of this and their survival potential in an area that's outside Bodega Bay, being that there are large quantities of sharks here. I mean, I've seen them myself. I've interacted with them on a regular basis when we're fishing. So I'm just wondering, are we sure this is going to work? Do we know that?
With sea otters, we're never sure of anything. The one thing we're sure of is that sea otters will do what they want to do within the context of the options we give them. So yes, we don't want to throw sea otters to the sharks. And sharks are one of the main reasons that we haven't seen range expansion in 20 years of the southern sea otter range in either direction. But it's been a lot longer since we've seen northward range expansion. And we believe that's because of the high density of sharks up there near the current end of the northern range. So that's why estuaries are especially favorable in our eyes, because estuaries have shallow waters. They mostly prevent entry of white sharks. Estuaries, we now see, can support extremely high densities of sea otters, and the populations can grow faster in an estuary than on the outer coast just because of the configuration of the habitat. So yes, we're looking hard at estuaries. Then there's the idea, well, you put sea otters somewhere, they often go wherever they want. That's what they do. So we could put them in an estuary and they could leave and they could get whacked by sharks. It's very possible. it's even likely. But sea otters, as people have mentioned, they're not dumb either. So if they become aware of shark bite mortality, and there's debate about how much sea otters are aware of it because it's usually a stealth attack, if they become aware of it, they quickly adjust their behavior. As they have with killer whales, they adjust their behavior. We don't know if they're aware of white sharks. But if they become aware, then they will adjust their behavior. And then there's just the reality that estuaries are, as we've seen in Elkhorn Slough, they're extremely favorable habitat, especially for mothers with pups. Because out on the outer coast, you have storms and things. Your chance of pup separation is a lot greater on the outer coast, especially during storms. Inside estuaries, in Elkhorn Slough, we see these females way back there in the salt marsh. They never, as far as we know, they never even leave the slough. They have their pups back there. It's fantastic habitat. But then if we want to restore kelp beds, maybe we want to pick an estuary with rocky habitat right outside. So we have this sort of back and forth between the kelp forest, sea otters right outside the estuary, and we kind of have this safe source of otters in the estuary. But again, that's certainly not for me alone to decide. We have a lot of great minds thinking about all these options. And again, no options whatsoever have been decided on. This is the beginning of the conversation.
Thank you so much. And we will have time again for questions later today, but so as to not interfere with anyone's lunch, we are going to break now until 12 o'clock, and there is lunch outside at the registration tables for everyone to pick up.
And thank you so much, Congressman Huffman.
All right, we're going to get started with our after-lunch panel. I hope everyone enjoyed their lunch.
Go ahead and keep talking. They'll
I'd like to welcome Paul Gullixson, Communications Manager for Sonoma County. He has the enviable job of being the moderator for our next panel right after lunch. So we appreciate the short lunch period and you coming back for the potential socio-economic impact and opportunities panel.
Thank you. Thank you, Tracy. Well, good afternoon, everybody. What a great day. You know, this has been a great forum when, after the last morning session, more people rush forward to keep the conversation going than head for the food. And that's really, it's been wonderful to hear the conversations that have been going on. So, as Tracy mentions, my name is Paul Gullixson. I'm the Communications Manager for the county, and I'm very pleased to be with you for this panel. So far today, we've talked about the sea otter history and the potential impacts of sea otter reintroduction on our marine ecosystems. Now we're going to take a step back and get out of the water a little bit and look at more of the socio-economic impacts and the potential socio-economic impacts of the reintroduction of southern sea otters on the North Coast. And joining us for this panel, we have two experts who will be joining us remotely. One is Brian Vander Naald, who is Associate Professor of Economics at Drake University in Des Moines, Iowa. He has seen his research published. So many of you may be familiar with his work. He's had his research published in many journals, including Ecological Economics, Land Economics, and Econosphere. His most recent work estimates a non-market value for sea otters in the North Pacific. We also have with us Dr. Edward Gregr, an adjunct professor at the Institute for Resources, Environment, and Sustainability in British Columbia, and the principal of SciTech Environmental Consulting. He's a research scientist with over 30 years of experience in the spatial analysis of marine systems. We also are very pleased to have with us today Jessica Fujii, who is the Sea Otter Program Manager and Principal Investigator for the Monterey Bay Aquarium. where they have a program that works towards the recovery of sea otters and their ecosystems through research monitoring and the rehabilitation of stranded sea otters for release. We're very eager to hear what she has to tell us today. Most recently, she has been working on to better understand the economic value of sea otters and Elkhorn Slough, which was brought up just recently. And last but not least, of course, we have with us Ethan Brown, our newly appointed Executive Director for the Sonoma County Economic Development Board. He was interim for a while. He's just been appointed as our Executive Director. During his 11 years with EDB, Ethan has also served in multiple roles, including as Director of Business Development, Innovation, Business Retention and Expansion Program Manager, and Entrepreneurial Services Program Manager. In addition, he has extensive experience in helping businesses in resource recovery during natural disasters. Plus, he knows what it's like to have his own business, as prior to joining the county and the EDB board, he was a principal in a local contracting firm, which he helped to grow, launch and grow. So please welcome our panelists for today. So I'm going to start, Ethan, I'm going to start with you. And Tim Tinker mentioned that urchins tend to change their behavior dramatically when otters are present. Well, I can assure you that the same can be said of humans, because I was recently at a Monterey Bay Aquarium event, and after our event, a very fancy event, and all of us were standing around, and well-dressed people with glasses of champagne. They had free run of the aquarium. And where's the one place they went? They all crowded around the windows in front of the otter program, right? The otter exhibit. People love otters. So my first question to you is, what in your view are the potential impacts of sea otter reintroduction in Sonoma County, particularly in the area of ecotourism?
Paul, you had me a little bit worried there that you were going to ask me a question about urchin behavior. When you
No, human behavior. We're talking about human behavior.
Started sweating a little bit. And I also want to say that as I've networked around the room today, I've learned that a lot of you are doing work in this area. So I'm going to keep it intentionally high level, but fulfill my promise to District 5 and you, Paul. I think that it helps to think of the economy in a very similar way that we consider the ecosystem. In that one small change or introduction of new elements begets more change. And similar to our environment, these can be small changes, they can be large changes, they can be beneficial, they could be not so beneficial, right? But what they have in common is they tend to create a ripple effect. And in economics, we call that an economic multiplier. It has been documented by other areas, and I think my co-panelist here is going to speak to that there is a beneficial effect on tourism. Right now, Sonoma County is probably best known for wine tourism, food, beverage, that sort of a thing. It's not a far stretch to say that folks who come here specifically, or that would come here specifically to see sea otter activity, might have more of an outdoor rec or envirotourism interest than the bulk of the visitors we currently see here. And so what I would say broadly, one of the benefits that you could see here, not speaking strictly in economic terms, is that you see a diversification of the tourism industry here that could really benefit us when wine tourism hits a lull for economic reasons or otherwise, and that we maintain that activity in this county. Activity which, by the way, helps to support restaurants and other businesses, along with brings valuable services, funds valuable services to the county. So overall, I would say, the impact that I would focus on is that diversity that it would bring to our tourism economy.
Great. Well, I'll come back to you in just a minute. I'm going to go to Jessica real quick, because on that note, you want to talk to us about, we had Congressman Huffman talk about, obviously, the excitement the public has about otters. And could you tell us a little bit about your sea otter rescue and rehabilitation program at the aquarium?
Yeah, of course. Lilian gave a great introduction right before lunch, but in case any of you missed that, we have been rescuing sick, injured, and orphaned sea otters since the early 1980s. And in the early 2000s, we began a surrogacy program where we're able to pair these orphaned pups with our non-releasable adult females, and they form this amazing bond and are able to teach these pups all the skills that they need to survive in the wild. And so for over the past 20 years, we have been able to rescue these pups and re-release them back to the wild. And in addition to that, we're doing a lot of research to understand what are the impacts of that particular program, but also involved with other research on the ecosystem and more recently the economic impacts. And we have found that our surrogacy program is really successful. Overall, we have seen 75% of the otters that we release are able to fully integrate into the wild. And once they do that, they go on to survive and reproduce just like their wild sea otters. And so much of this work was focused in Elkhorn Slough, which Dr. Hughes mentioned earlier, and able to see population impacts of that. That population grew from about 20 sea otters to over 100 over a 15-year time period. And then we were not expecting this at the time, but those ecosystem impacts that Dr. Hughes was able to research and show on the positive benefits we saw on the sealgrass in the area as well.
That's great. That's great. Well, we're going to go to one of our panelists online. Let's go to Brian Vander Naald. And Brian, if you're with us, we would like to, you've done extensive research in this area. What do you see as the costs and benefits of sea otter reintroduction in this area?
Yeah, so from other parts of the Pacific coast, we have a couple of large studies that have done a nice job of kind of cataloging the costs and benefits. The main cost of introducing sea otters and observing their expansion would be for the so-called dive fisheries. So crabs, clams, urchins, oysters, whatever's in the area. That's the main cost from an economic perspective. I'm sure there are others, but they're probably smaller. And then the benefits that we've seen in other areas, British Columbia and projected in Oregon, sorry, we haven't seen them yet, they're projected, would be mainly with respect to kelp. So the scientists they spoke earlier about how urchins eat the kelp, and so when there's more kelp, you've got nursery habitat for fin fishes, and then the dead kelp falls to the bottom of the sea in the form of sequestered carbon. So those are two bigger benefits. The largest by far in the areas that have been reviewed up and down the Pacific coast has been tourism. So when Representative Huffman mentioned the tourism boon, that's consistent with what we've seen. And I'll talk a little bit about the specific research later.
Well, maybe you could tell us, is there empirical evidence from other geographic locations that might help predict how different stakeholders might respond to the reintroduction of the southern sea otter?
Yeah, absolutely. In fact, I'm going to get to Ed's study second. There are a couple of big studies that have tried to catalog the economic and ecological, projected ecological costs and benefits. One is from Oregon, the Alaka Institute, and they're contemplating sea otter reintroduction in 4 different areas in Oregon. And the two main the main cost that they focused on was the negative impacts to commercial fisheries. And again, that, gooey ducks and the so-called dive fisheries. The main benefit they focused on was increased tourism. And so in 3 of the 4 areas, the benefits from additional tourism from sea otter reintroduction would outweigh the disbenefits or the costs associated with the commercial fishery losses there. But in one of them, the commercial fishery losses outweighed the benefits. And this study was very surface level. The the methods used were pretty what I guess I would call shallow. I like to think of these costs and benefits as little rabbit holes, and you can either peer down them or just notice them from 100 feet above, or you can go all the way to the bottom. And so Ed, who's on the panel with us today, was on another study, and they dove at least partway down each of these rabbit holes and a few more of the rabbit holes. And so this was a study from British Columbia, so Vancouver Island in particular. And they predicted that sea otters would cause a loss to the dive fisheries of around $7.3 million, which in context is smaller in magnitude than the predicted increase in value from the finfish benefits from increased kelp habitat, and orders of magnitude smaller than the projected increased tourism values. And so those are the two big studies that have done a comprehensive look at costs and benefits of otter expansion or reintroduction. And then I was part of a project with Dr. Hughes many years ago, and I'm just now digging into a survey that I ran, and this is one of those rabbit holes that I went all the way to the bottom of. I surveyed with a colleague 1,100 respondents, fairly representative of the United States potential users and actual users, and we essentially wanted to know how much they were willing to pay to see otters on a typical marine tour in Southeast Alaska. So just add them as an attribute. And what we found is that for comparable levels of chances of seeing sea otters compared to whales, the willingness to pay to see sea otters was actually higher than that of whales. And if you consider that whales, the whale watching industry in Alaska is upwards of $100 million per year, it could be pretty substantial. The benefit from increased tourism could be pretty substantial. So those are the three main areas all on the Pacific Coast that would be similar in costs and benefits in terms of classifying them to the North Coast there. It's going to differ. So infrastructure on Vancouver Island is different than it is in Bodega Bay, right? You've got people driving over from large population centers in San Francisco and Sonoma. The critters on which the sea otters feed is obviously going to differ, like the scientists mentioned. The sizes of the industries are different, right? And so these are all context and geography specific, but could help inform projected costs and benefits in the Bodega Bay area.
Well, thank you very much. And in fact, let's go to Dr. Edward Gregr now in British Columbia. Dr. Gregr, Brian mentioned your research. What other benefits or values do you think we should be important for us to consider before reintroducing sea otters? Well, the catchphrase of the decade. You're on mute.
Thank you very much for the question, Paul. Can you hear me?
Yeah, we hear you.
Okay, terrific. I'd like to start just by thanking Supervisor Hopkins for inviting me. I'm really honored to be here at what is essentially the ground level of this very exciting work. I'd also like to acknowledge that I'm coming to you or speaking to you from the unceded territories and lands of the Coast Salish people. I'm very grateful to be able to live my life on the lands of the Squamish, Tsleil-Waututh, and Musqueam First Nations. It's really a beautiful part of the world here, and I'm grateful for that. Now, to your question, I'd like to start by setting a bit of background.
Sure.
First of all, in the developed world that we live here, our decision making around the use of resources and their management is firmly rooted in economics. And I mean, this is understandable because so much of our world is about costs and benefits, right? So as natural scientists, when we try and inform management with the studies that we do in the natural world, we always try and speak that language. So we're trying to monetize the benefits or the impacts that we find. And this is why in our study, we limited ourselves to things that we thought we could reasonably attach a dollar value to. But nature provides us so much more, right? This is something that is commonly now called ecosystem services. And these are generally grouped into 4 categories: provisioning, regulating, supporting, and cultural, okay? Now, provisioning is the most obvious one. It is what it sounds like. It's food, clean water, energy, other material goods. And of course, in our world, these are the things that are easiest to monetize. Regulating services are things like flood control or erosion control. These are 2 services that are regulated by species like beavers, for example, or kelp forests on the coast. Water purification is another example, where if you manage to keep your watersheds intact, you get clean water for free. Otherwise, you have to build treatment plants, right? So we can monetize these things by comparing what it costs to replace those sorts of services. For example, the cost of a treatment plant versus the cost, which is really an opportunity cost of keeping a watershed intact. So we're kind of good at getting at the dollar value of those services. But the last 2 services, the supporting and cultural, are increasingly more difficult. Now with supporting services, those are things that keep ecosystems going. They keep nature taking over time. These are things like habitat provisioning, soil formation, biodiversity. And these are hard to monetize because they're embedded in an ecosystem. And that is really just a nest of linkages, which we don't often understand all the connections of, never mind figuring out how things affect other things. So it's hard to capture everything in a supporting service to monetize it. Now, in the case of sea otters, yes, it's coming back to sea otters. We have this unique situation that was mentioned earlier, that because of the unfortunate, if you like, grand experiment of the maritime fur trade, we have this natural experiment that's going on where we can look at ecosystems with and without otters in them. And so we've learned an awful lot about the supporting services that sea otters can provide in these systems. So we can look at, in the sea otter context, we can look at some of those trade-offs as well. The one thing that natural science can't tell us very much about is how sea otters influence cultural services, the importance of sea otters to relationships and different groups of people. In our studies, we try and get at this through recreational values. That is the most obvious and most easily monetizable cultural service, but it really only scratches the surface. You know, what matters most to people are things like a sense of place, cultural heritage, spiritual values, reciprocal relationships with non-human beings, inspirational and aesthetic values, things like that. And these are often deeply held, overriding monetary concerns for many people. And so just to add to the earlier question about why, Chairman Franklin very well articulated the kind of values that are important to some of the people on the coast. And this is what's motivating, at least in part, the desire to see sea otters come back to the coast. And different groups of people, different individuals hold different sets of these values in different levels of importance. So it gets quite tricky. So thank you for your patience. And to finally answer the question then, you know, it's these kind of cultural values and benefits that I think need to be considered to truly develop a collaborative approach around how, where, and why, really, to reintroduce sea otters to your coast. And I'm really pleased, really excited to see the inclusive and collaborative tone that I see underpinning this summit. And I guess I just add that this isn't easy, right? Otherwise, everybody would be doing it. This is perhaps the hardest, most difficult part of our attempts to manage our natural resources, of these deeply held values that are very difficult to monetize and that are very difficult to assign to larger groups because we're all individuals. So the social science is the hard part. not an easy task, I think, but a necessary one, and one that's facilitated by these sorts of conversations.
Well, maybe we can get into the weeds a little bit. I just, as I noted in your introduction, you have
We're there already.
We're already. I know. Well, we're gonna. You have extensive experience in spatial analysis of marine systems. Our question is, do you think it's realistic to develop a spatial management strategy for sea otters? And before you get into that, maybe you could start by explaining to everybody what exactly a spatial management strategy looks like.
Sure. Well, a spatial management strategy would, at least in my understanding, provide a system, a geographic area where sea otters are present in some places and not present in others. And I think at least from my perspective, the short answer to this is, yeah, this is definitely possible. And I base that confidence in a few things. First of all, we have pretty good archaeological data from the Pacific Northwest, mostly up in the Aleutians, which shows that pre-contact in the millennia before the fur trade, where people lived along this coast, the coast was actually a patchwork of urchin barrens and kelp forests, and those urchin barrens were around the coastal communities, because those communities, certainly at that time, before the glaciers had fully withdrawn, needed to keep warm, and sea otters were the fur of choice, of course. So even before the fur trade, the coast was a mosaic of urchin barrens and kelp forests. The second line of evidence is from our coast here, where First Nations made use of clam gardens, what we call clam gardens, which are these culturally modified pieces of the shoreline, which are built up to enhance clam production. And it would be reasonable to assume that those clam gardens were built for the people that lived there, not sea otters. So the otters would have been excluded from those gardens in some way. And given that there was a hunt for sea otters, that sea otters were used for furs further north, but in our part of the world, they were used as regalia for chiefs and seen as valuable gifts that were shared during important cultural ceremonies. It's quite likely that they were excluded using lethal means during those times. Now, to fully answer the question, what we would do in a contemporary world, we kind of have to ask the question like why and how we would do it, right? In BC, where in our area of interest on the west coast of Vancouver Island that Brian mentioned, that was the point of introduction to sea otters in Canada. And that population has grown to the point where the coastal communities have been deprived of their ability to live off the land. There's no more natural resources, no more shellfish for them to make a subsistence living on. And I mean, this is not all the fault of the sea otters. There are lots of fisheries management issues, landscape management issues that also contributed to the decline of food on the coast here. But right now, today, a lot of folks see sea otters as their main competitor for coastal resources, particularly clams and urchins and geoduck clams, which are a larger burrowing clam. So the nations here are proposing to put up resource protection areas around their valuable clam beds, and they would do that with a small ceremonial hunt. But I don't believe that lethality is necessary to create these sorts of exclusion zones. There is an entire body of work, a growing body of work on fearscapes. It's small but growing, and this is about creating a space where animals don't feel comfortable. As has been pointed out already, sea otters, like all animals, are very good at learning. So it may be that some form of hazing would be enough to exclude the sea otters from particular places. The important thing, I believe, is that any of this sort of conditioning would have to be constant, or at least regularly applied, because the animals would learn when the hazing comes and when it doesn't. So if you actually want to use that approach, you need to be somewhat consistent about it. And if there's a place, as you have in California, where there's enough people, then that's potentially feasible. And I think that this approach would probably be more effective and probably more cost effective than physical barriers or population control or things like constant relocations, which I understand you guys tried in the South at one point without much success, because as Lilian pointed out, otters will go where otters go. So yeah, I think it's doable, but you need to be clear on what you're trying to accomplish, and probably we'll need a little bit of research around what a fearscape would look like for a sea otter.
Well, thank you. That's fascinating. I'd like to know a little bit more what otter hazing looks like. I was always taught hazing was not something you were allowed to do, but that sounds great. Well, let's bring it back a little bit more to the North Coast. And Jessica, as Dr. Tinker said earlier, otters, they think local and they live local. I love that. And Ethan, that sounds like something for our tourism board to take up as a new bumper sticker.
One of them on staff.
Yeah. So you've certainly seen that in Monterey Bay, and I just wanted to ask, what are some of the possible ocean health and ecotourism impacts you've seen based on your observations in the Monterey Bay area and what you're doing there?
Yeah, so as we've heard, there's many different ways to study economic impacts, how broad of scope, future impacts versus actual impacts happening at the time. So we recently did some work in Elkhorn Slough because of the prior releases of sea otters we had done there to understand who is coming to the estuary, what activities are they doing, and what are the economic impacts of that, and then what role do sea otters play in any of those things to better understand how people value their recreational space and wildlife. And so this paper hopefully will be getting published in the next couple of weeks. Definitely not going to try and go over all of it, but we were pretty excited to find that recreational tourism, people coming for kayaking, paddleboarding, eco tours to see wildlife, hiking, fishing, through both direct spending and indirect benefits, millions of dollars annually could be contributed to the local economies just from this one particular site, a 12-kilometer long estuary. And over the last decade, we have actually seen the number of businesses that can be supported in that area grow, directed to those users. Additionally, we asked them, while they were there, what did they value about their visit? Was it just how convenient it was? If you haven't been to Elkhorn Slough, it's right off of Highway 1. There's multiple access points. There's diverse wildlife. And what we found, if people were actually able to see the sea otters in the wild, that actually impacted how much they valued seeing them as part of their whole visit, even if that's not their reason for going to the area. And then we found, by asking them, as we heard earlier, a willingness to pay. Right now, Elkhorn Slough is open access. There's limited access points, but you don't have to pay a fee to enter. So we use this question of how much would you be willing to pay to access Elkhorn Slough? And this fee would go towards protecting the estuary and protecting the sea otters. While we have no plans to actually enact this fee, it was a way to evaluate the financial relationship they placed on these conservation activities. And we again found that as people were able to see sea otters and appreciated them, they were more willing to spend money on an additional fee beyond their rental fees or their hotel fees for that purpose. And so that could be applied as a case study for other areas moving forward, as additional ways to either subsidize other costs and benefits or protect areas that are not currently having sea otters. And so we really saw this as a very narrowed in look at what is going on in our own backyard and hopefully as a case study of what people might expect to see in other areas moving forward.
That's great. That's great. I know, we're going to wind it down. We have time for one more question, but I'm fascinated. So when is the study going to be published, you said?
It's in press, so hopefully in the next couple of weeks.
And what publication?
It's with the Journal of Coastal and Ocean Economics.
Okay.
We were doing a collaborative research with Middlebury Institute of International Sciences and the Center of the Blue Economy.
That's great. Thank you very much. We'll keep an eye out, look for that, and share that with everybody. Ethan, I'm gonna end back with you, and this has been a really good conversation, but we come back to the point is, moving forward, what do we do? So I'm gonna ask you, what does the ideal engagement process look like for Sonoma County concerning the reintroduction of sea otters, and who are the key stakeholders we need to have at the table as we move forward?
Well, it starts with this, right? This is amazing. And I don't have to tell the folks in this room that when you have people engaged in a process and they feel like they're contributing and they're allowed the opportunity to shape that process, that they have ownership over it, when there are outcomes. And so, from the economic development perspective, what I kind of offer is that we do as much outreach to business as possible, and I want to be considered a partner in that. I would also point to Claudia in the back of the room there, who runs our tourism bureau. I think together we can be excellent partners in helping bring businesses to the table. Anyone who generates income from proximity to the water, outdoor recreation activities that are complementary to this, to understand what the opportunities are and how to quell or answer to some of the fears, I think, that are well-founded and that we've heard from today. So I know that's a short, pithy answer. I almost feel out of place talking about the best practices when it starts with something like this, and I'm merely a panelist here. So I think this is a fantastic start, and I'm looking forward to continued participation in it.
Well, we appreciate you being here, and please give a round of applause to all our panelists. Thank you very much.
So I think that we're going to begin with a lightning round of everyone just stating, so that we can get through everybody, just your name and your agency or organization or affiliation, because you're all in the room for a reason, because you are critical partners as this moves forward. And so we just want to do that, and then we will shift into Q&A, and that way if we go a little bit over, at least everyone knows who is in the room. So Tracy will be handing the mic around.
Melanie Parker, Sonoma County Regional Parks.
Kai Cooper with Senator Mike McGuire's office.
Charlie Schneider with California Trout.
Leo Chi, District Director working for Linda Hopkins.
Tara Duggan with San Francisco Chronicle.
Elise Wylans, Supervisor Hopkins team.
Amy Cohen, I'm an intern with Supervisor Hopkins.
Susan Kirks, Madrone Audubon, and Badger Naturalist.
Lupe Catalan with the Office of Supervisor Linda Hopkins.
Debbie Ramirez, Field Rep with Supervisor Linda Hopkins.
Karen Gear with the State Coastal Conservancy.
Mary Callahan with the Press Democrat newspaper.
Stephen Nett with an eventual Sonoma Coast Nature Discovery Center.
Kathleen Chasey, Point Arena Stewards.
Jenna Bentall, Sea Otter Savvy.
Lilian Carswell, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service.
Grant Downey, California Commercial Sea Urchin Diver and Recreational Diver.
Jessica Fujii, Monterey Bay Aquarium, Sea Otter Program.
Amy Wolfram, California Policy Manager for Monterey Bay Aquarium.
I'm Terry Bertles, California State Parks.
Steve Barrett, Sonoma County Regional Parks.
Ruth Urch, variously affiliated.
Richard Charter, the Ocean Foundation.
Drew McCauley, Sonoma County Coast MAC and Cordell Marine Sanctuary Foundation.
Claudia Vecchio, Sonoma County Tourism.
Katie Rice, Marin County Board of Supervisors and Coastal Commission.
David Goldenberg, California Sea Urchin Commission.
Dick Ogg, commercial fisherman.
Tracy Grimes, California Department of Fish and Wildlife.
Paul Gullixson, Communications Manager, County of Sonoma.
Brent Hughes, Sonoma State.
Heather Barrett, Sea Otter Savvy.
Josh Smith, Monterey Bay Aquarium.
Delaha Shahushi Rosalauchi from Talawadini Nation. Which way do I go?
Bert Whitaker, Sonoma County Regional Parks.
Ben Becker, National Park Service.
Michael Allen, Sonoma County Conservation Action. Lance Morgan, Marine Conservation Institute.
Brendan O'Neill, California State Parks.
Melissa Apuya, Assembly Member Connolly's office.
Eamon O'Byrne, Sonoma Land Trust.
Angela Zepp, Greater Farallones Association and Greater Farallones National Marine Sanctuary.
Maria Brown, Superintendent of NOAA's Greater Farallones and Cordell Bank National Marine Sanctuaries.
Tristan McHugh, the Nature Conservancy.
Whitaker Strain with Bodega Bay Oyster Company.
Mark Escajeda, Redwood Coast Land Conservancy.
Barbara Lee, Director of Climate Action and Resiliency, County of Sonoma.
I think there's some folks standing. I don't know, Tracy, if you wanted to run back. I see Supervisor Williams back.
Ted Williams, Mendocino County, District 5. I share a border with Supervisor Hopkins, one of her biggest fans. I was here exactly 1 month ago. I flew back from Copenhagen, had a long morning to get to a board meeting in Ukiah, and at the end of the day said, we're getting together at Bodega tomorrow. So I'm happy to be here, and I'm happy that you're here with me this time.
Will Tasconi with the Senator Jim Wood's office. Thank you, Supervisor Hopkins.
And this will kick off our question and answer session. So initially we had thought to write down the questions, but it's easy enough just to pass the mic. And so we'll invite folks with questions to just kind of flag me down. I'll bring you the mic. And if you are a panelist and you would like to respond, or a moderator, and can we watch online as well? If folks online would like to respond, then they can jump in. But please go behind the podium to answer. So just flag me down.
Is there any consideration of multi-species simultaneous reintroductions? Seems like that might have a higher probability of success.
That's a great question. Which of our panelists would like to jump into that one? Do we think Tim online? You want to? Okay, we'll start with Brent, and then if Tim online wants to jump, it looks like Tim is actually ready. So do you want to do Tim first and then Brent? Does that sound good? Okay, great. We'll go Tim and then Brent.
Darn, I was hoping Brent would go first. That's a great question. The one other species that springs to mind is the sea star, and as we've heard from several of our speakers, particularly Josh and Josh's work looked at this. We are increasingly realizing that there's sort of complementarity between sea otters and other species, and the sunflower star, the predatory sunflower star, is one of those, and that species is still missing from ecosystems south of British Columbia, certainly, or even southeast Alaska. So there is the challenge that sea star wasting disease still seems to be present and affecting stars, and Josh may have more updated information on that. A lot of the other species whose abundances change as sea otters come into and start participating within a food web are already there. It's just the relative abundances change as the sort of food web adjusts to the return of sea otters. So there's not so much that other species are missing completely. It's just more they're there, but at lower abundances. That applies to a lot of the kelp species as well. But I think it's a really good question. I mean, I think the multi-species approach, or really the biological and human community approach, is much is what we want to strive for rather than just a single species approach. So thinking about other species that are going to be interacting with sea otters, including people again, is something that's really important to do from the outset. And if there are certain species missing, like predatory sea stars, I think devoting a lot of thought and potentially research into how that's going to affect the transition, or whether, how, if there is a potential of bringing back sea stars as well. We do know that sea otter impacts are more complete when sea stars and otters are present together. So it's a great question. Maybe Brent will have a more compelling answer than I have.
I was going to say the exact same thing as you. But yeah, the sunflower star in particular, that's the big one with the many legs. So it's gone right now from the state of California. There has been maybe one sighting in Noyo Harbor, but that was one tiny individual. But we have been working on this, and when I say we, it's my colleague from the University of Washington. His name's Jason Hoden, who's been developing a program to rear sunflower stars and reintroduce them. And we were just funded by California Sea Grant to start initiating that. And so, when I say we, I mean Jason. And so the idea is that they do have sunflower stars up there in Washington. They have kind of come back after the wasting disease. And so they have the stars to work with. And so the idea is that they develop the kind of the strategy on culturing the sunflower stars and then reintroduction. But like Tim was saying, having a what we call a functional redundancy, meaning you have not just one predator, but you have two or three, and you have this portfolio of predators that could work in the system is probably ideal.
Hi, thanks. Where can I find out more about how terrestrial land management can positively impact a project like this?
So who wants to take that one on? Who do we think of our panelists would be best equipped to answer that one? You stumped them. And actually, I would like to open it beyond just our panelists, because we actually have a tremendous amount of other subject matter expertise in the room. I'm wondering if there's any information from the Marine Tribal Alliance. There's been any conversations around the connectivity between sort of the marine and terrestrial ecosystems. I'll just open it up to anyone who wants to jump in on that question. Lilian, come on up. And they want you to be behind here.
I'm just going to start this response while you all are formulating, and then please come up here and relieve me with your suggestions. But two things come to mind. One is that we have some diseases that are transmitted from land to sea in sea otters. And with climate change, we expect the impacts of those diseases probably to increase because we have increased intensity of rainfall that overwhelms natural filtration systems and allows those pathogens to enter the water. We're also likely to see range shifts in organisms because of climate change, like some will be traveling further north to escape warming temperatures. And with those changes of ranges, we have interactions that are brand new, that have never occurred before. And so that sort of creates a hotbed for evolution of pathogens, and so we may be seeing new pathogens. And so one thing we can do is try to restore those natural filtration systems that filter the land that comes from land to sea. So that means leaving the vegetation that can soak up the water. It means not paving surfaces by putting permeable surfaces, and especially in restoring wetlands. So wetlands are some of the most endangered environments there are. Humans have filled them in and destroyed them, and diked them and converted them. And those wetlands are something extremely valuable, just not just for wildlife to be prevented from the impacts of pathogens, but to help soak up flooding and prevent storm surge. Like they're this buffer between land and sea. So they're really crucial. And then when we talk about the habitat value of estuaries for sea otters, it's quite amazing how many sea otters can live in these wetlands if they're restored. And so in Elkhorn Slough, they've done incredible work trying to restore parts of the slough and, in fact, to increase climate resilience. So some portions of the slough were diked and drained and then grazed or farmed. And all that went away. There's saltwater intrusion in the well, so none of that is happening. So these were just like mud flats that were doing nothing. And people at Elkhorn Slough Reserve, they looked at these historical maps of where the tidal creeks were, and they brought in all this soil as infill, like clean soil, and they programmed the tractors to follow these paths and recreate these tidal creeks that existed 100 years ago. Like totally amazing restoration vision. And they raised the level of the marsh so that it will be resilient to climate change. As sea level rises, the marsh will not get flooded in that area. So those are state-of-the-art things that people can consider doing. And I guess part of that also is coastal retreat. As sea level rises, wetlands are being squeezed. They're going to be drowned on one side and come up against development on the other. And I think if we're realistic, we all realize that human development does need to retreat. It's highly controversial because that's the most expensive property. People don't want to leave it. But some of it's falling into the ocean anyway. We need to restore these natural buffers between the land and sea.
A potential resource for you is the County of Sonoma Board of Supervisors last year adopted a climate resilient land strategy. It doesn't specifically address reintroduction of sea otters, but it does divide the county into ecoregions based on the type of the landscape and ecosystem within the landscape, and has recipes for different types of resilience building strategies for those different ecoregions. And you can download the land strategy and you can look at the recipes for the different types of resilience building within each of the ecoregions that would be relevant to the land type that you're interested in working on.
Oh, thanks. Excuse me. Yeah, I still had a question about the idea that sea otters would help clear urchins in urchin barrens, since they've been shown not to do that when urchins are basically empty. So I was curious about how that would work here compared to in the Monterey area.
I'm just here to just hold one of you.
Thanks, Tara. That's a great question. So the context of the Monterey Bay region is very different in many ways. So earlier we discussed how up on the north coast of California, these kelp forests are primarily dominated by bull kelp, and then on the central coast, it's primarily the giant kelp. So there are some ways in which these systems are different. And at least in the Monterey Bay region,
this urchin outbreak occurred in a place where sea otters have been pretty well established for at least a few decades. And so what we saw was that when this mosaic of barrens and forests initiated, there was this, otters basically had a choice. There was a choice of eat the healthy urchins in the patches of kelp forests, or eat the starved ones that are in the barrens. And Monterey for many years has been this region where otters will tend to focus in on certain prey items. So otters will eat lots of different things, but in some cases otters will sort of narrow in and focus on particular prey items. And so in the case of urchins, we actually saw that otters stepped up their foraging. So they actually started eating more urchins after the outbreak than before. But again, the location of where they were foraging on urchins was really specific. It was pretty well restricted to the patches of kelp forests. However then, when thinking about reintroduction, there are some other examples that we can draw from. And so I mentioned earlier this example from the Aleutian Islands where otters were hunted from these islands. And this is this archipelago of islands where otters were hunted away from the islands, right? And then those islands that were once kelp forests became barrens. And presumably, those urchins on the islands were starved because they were barrens. There was no more kelp. But then when recovery efforts initiated and the otters moved back into those islands, they reduced the number of sea urchins and the kelp came back. So I think that contexts are really important, but also those are some of the examples that we have to draw on.
Just following up on what you just said, it seems to me, so if I'm a new sea otter in a bull kelp forest that hasn't formed well enough yet, and there's starving urchins, then I'll eat the abalone, or I'll eat the crabs, or et cetera. So the one thing I was really going to say was in this room of 60 of us, there's 4 fishermen, commercial fishermen, not recreational, from what I could tell. And it seems, Linda, are we missing that voice? The commercial fisherman voice? Because there are some voices here, but there's probably a stronger, I live in Mendocino County, and I think there's going to be a lot of questions about whether or not releasing sea otters there. So I think there's an educational program to fishermen. You know, they're slapped on the right for salmon, they're slapped on the left for crabbing. It's the pressures on commercial fishermen, of which I am not, but I'm sympathetic. So I would have expected a little bit more controversy or a little bit more education or work toward education for commercial fishermen. So that's sort of my comment.
You can actually blame me because I formed the invite list, but I don't know if...
Yeah, I'm not sure if that question was for me or for
I think
for
that
others.
question was for me, and you can blame me for that. We are a little bit over time, but it looks like we have a couple of questions in the back.
Tracy? Yeah, I'd just like to dovetail on that point. Again, my name is Whitstrain. I represent Bodega Bay Oyster Company. We have operations here in Bodega and Tamales Bays, and I had a comment and then a question maybe for some of the panelists. I'm wondering, you know, that it sounded like there had been some studies and work done down in Morro Bay concerning reintroduction of otter species, and I'm just wondering if anyone could speak to the interaction down there between the two operating oyster farms and the sea otter population, sort of as a precedent to what we're talking about here. And then, you know, the comment would be that, you know, I'd really encourage everyone, when we're talking about this kind of stuff, to consider, you know, I would really consider oysters part of that strong natural buffer between what happens on land and what happens in the sea, given the oyster's role as a filtering system for water. And I would strongly encourage everyone to think about that idea of resource protection areas when we are talking about introduction of otters into an estuarine environment. We farm about 90 acres down in Tamales, and those oysters are more or less, they're providing a vital ecosystem service, but they're essentially sitting ducks for an active predator. And that's not to say that all otters are going to be eating shellfish, but I think it's a possibility. So thank you.
Hi, Whit, thanks for the question. Just to make sure I heard it all correctly, you're wanting to know a little bit more about what maybe has been going on and who's been contacted in the discussions with the 2 oyster companies down in Morro Bay, is that correct? Yeah, so I had the pleasure of meeting with the owner of Grassy Bar Oyster Company, and he took me out to see his farm and get a really good look, and we did an interview. And it was really eye-opening, so it was nice is that we were able to sort of discuss the pros and cons, all the different sort of regulations that he's under. But then I also sort of asked about this sort of reintroduction as sea otters are starting to go further back into Morro Bay. What sort of things has he been noticing, or have there been sort of conflicts that have been arising? And what was interesting is that over the last few years, he said there's only been 1 or 2 instances where sea otters ever even attempted to do anything, and it was usually with a type of material that they could break with their teeth, and it was because they had little baby oysters hanging off of one side that they had left for something like for that day. And that was opened up, but other than that, the type of material that he's using is very thick plastic, and they use hog ties to create these bags. He has ones that are at the bottom, and then he has others that are actually hanging through the eelgrass and actually helps with that filtration. So it creates a really good balance there. And at this point, he has not had any sea otters interact with any of his bags of that kind. So in his perspective, it has not been an issue for him. Thank you.
Yeah, I just wanted to add to that. I think that's a great question. So we did release a few of those surrogate reared sea otters in Morro Bay. And before we did that, we reached out to the oyster companies, to learn more about their operations, similar with Heather, and also to let them know if they were having issues to contact us. So similar experience as those otters established, even if they were resting near the operations, they weren't, destroying equipment and getting into the oysters. And there has been other research up in Alaska with different mariculture industries, and there were some studies showing that otters, by picking off mussels that were growing on the infrastructure, they were actually seeing some benefits. But I definitely think, as if this moves forward, those types of discussions are going to be incredibly vital.